Today, I'm going to tell you two stories about people who basically unknowingly risked everything just to travel to their dream locations. And they didn't realize they were in danger until it was already too late. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please promise the follow button a luxurious trip to Paris, but don't tell them you're sending them to Paris, Texas. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Baggage Claim. On the morning of Monday, January 7th, 1985, a 31-year-old man arrived at an international airport in order to board his flight to the United States. The man was very nervous. His heart was beating fast and his palms were sweating so much that he could barely hold the handles of his very heavy, tan-colored suitcase. And the reason he was so nervous is because he was feeling very conflicted about what he was about to do. On the one hand, this trip was something he'd been dreaming of for months, and it was supposed to represent the start of a great brand new life. Now, this man hadn't actually packed very many personal items to take with him. But one thing he had brought was a little bound book full of photographs, which showed what mattered the most to him. And what mattered the most was waiting for him in America. But on the other hand, the man was terrified, because before he could begin this brand new life, he had a huge problem he needed to take care of. And that problem was why he needed to drop off his very heavy suitcase without anybody looking inside of it. And so now, inside the airport, the very nervous man stopped and readjusted his grip on the suitcase handles, and then made his way over to the ticketing area, where he would check his bag for his almost 11-hour flight to California. And then, once he touched down and they landed in California, he could get off the plane, go to the baggage carousel, and get his luggage, and then everything would be fine. Now, of course, he knew this was a big gamble. If it had been possible, he would have just brought this bag with him on the plane to stow it in the overhead bin, but he just couldn't do it because the bag was too big, too heavy. And so really his only other choice, if he wanted the suitcase to make it to California, was to check it like he was doing, because the alternative was leaving it behind, and there was no way he was going to do that. He cared far too much about what was inside of this luggage. And so by the time the man actually got in line in the ticketing and baggage check area, he was so stressed out that he was beginning to feel physically ill. By the time he got to the front of the line, he still felt very sick, but he composed himself enough that he walked up to the counter of the airline he was traveling with, which was Lufthansa Airline, and the employee who was working behind the counter was very cheerful, and they greeted the man and took his passport to verify his information. Then the employee put down the passport and then reached out his hand and gestured for the nervous man to give him his very important suitcase. This was, of course, the moment the man had feared the most, when everything could really go astray. But as calm as he could, he lifted up the suitcase, and for a second he almost panicked because it was just so obviously heavy. He realized the employee might make him open it right there because it just seemed wrong that this suitcase was that heavy. And he knew if that happened, he was done for. He'd be arrested immediately. But instead, the employee just dragged the heavy suitcase over to a conveyor belt behind the counter, and the nervous man watched as the employee heaved the suitcase onto the belt, and the man kept his eyes locked on the suitcase as it rolled down the belt and then disappeared through a pair of rubber flaps at the very end. He was so focused on the bag, he almost didn't notice the airline employee returning to try to hand him his boarding pass for the plane. Finally, the employee literally just waved the ticket in the man's face to get his attention, and it kind of snapped him out of it, and he took the boarding pass, and as calmly as he could, he thanked the employee, and then he turned and hurried off to catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, another employee of Lufthansa Airlines walked around the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, which is typically just called LAX. It was about 2 p.m. Los Angeles time, and the employee was working in the international terminal. It was his job to monitor the circular carousels where passengers picked up their luggage after their flights, and his job was to make sure no bags were left behind. And as he was making one of these loops, he noticed there was a tan-colored suitcase with soft sides sitting all alone on one of the carousels. The employee stopped and checked the monitor above the carousel to see the last time this carousel had been used by an incoming plane, and it was quite a while ago, and all the passengers clearly had come through and picked up their luggage, except for this one lone bag. So, based on the timing, the employee figured that, well, this bag must be unclaimed. But this was not remotely concerning to him. I mean, luggage went unclaimed all the time. Sometimes because bags were sent to the wrong airport, or because the suitcase's owner missed their flight, or even just forgot to get it. But whatever the reason was, it was this employee's job to simply start the process of identifying the owner of the suitcase. So, like he always did, he walked over to the carousel and grabbed the suitcase handle and went to pick it up. But when he did, he let out a sort of surprised grunt and stumbled because the suitcase was so much heavier than he had expected. So he went back and he grabbed the handle with a better grip this time with two hands and braced himself and yanked, and the suitcase kind of toppled over and fell off the carousel onto the floor. And this was also around the time that the employee noticed that this really heavy suitcase had no tags on it. And so now this bag did seem very unusual. The extreme weight and no tags, that's not normal. So he knelt down and he began to unzip the suitcase to see what was inside. He was legally allowed to do this because unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search. But he had only unzipped it a little bit before he froze, and for a second he just stared in shock at what was inside of the suitcase. But then he immediately got to his feet, just left the bag there, and ran to go find a phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, around 3:45 p.m., Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in the baggage area of LAX's International Terminal, looking down grimly into the tan suitcase that was lying open on the floor. He was surrounded by officials from the LAPD, as well as the FBI, who had all been called to the airport because of what was found inside of the suitcase: the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was shocked. He guessed this woman was maybe less than 30 years old, and judging by her features and dark hair, he thought she could be from an Asian or Latin American country. But that was about as far as he could get, since she didn't have any identification with her, and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, so he couldn't immediately tell how she died. Ravens spent some time speaking to airline and airport employees, including Customs, which is the government agency that's in charge of inspecting bags that are coming in and out of the country. And he was puzzled as to how a suitcase with a body inside of it had somehow cleared customs. But an agent explained that they didn't actually open up all the suitcases, which meant whoever checked this bag through customs had taken a huge risk, because realistically, they could have been searched and then the body would have been found. So this suggested a certain level of desperation. But apparently this risk this person took to check the bag had paid off, because the bag had gone all the way to California. But despite that, Ravens didn't find much to go on here. At this moment, the victim was a Jane Doe, which meant there was no identification for her. And Ravens knew she could really be from anywhere in the world, despite, his snap judgment that perhaps she was from an Asian or Latin American country. And because LAX was an international airport, whoever checked this bag and potentially even put her into the suitcase could now be anywhere in the world too. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators had finished examining the body as it was found inside of the suitcase, they didn't actually pull her body out. They sent the suitcase and her body to the coroner. Hopefully, an autopsy would turn up evidence that could tell Ravens and the other investigators who this Jane Doe was and what happened to her. The following day, on Tuesday, Ravens sat down at his desk and he opened up a manila folder he had been given. Inside of it was his Jane Doe's autopsy report. And when the detective began reading it, he couldn't help but feel sick, because what he was reading told him that this poor woman had died a horrible, torturous death. The report said the woman had bruises all over her body, like the kind you would get from repeated heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive, and her actual eventual cause of death was ultimately suffocation, which meant she either was suffocated and then put into the suitcase, or was in the suitcase, trapped inside of there, and suffocated. Ravens put down the report and leaned back in his chair and just sort of thought through what he had just learned. Based on the autopsy, he now knew this poor woman had died a brutal, awful death, but the coroner had not found any identifying information or anything on her that would give away or help to give away who she actually was or who did this to her. So really he had very little here other than knowing this lady suffered. Ravens had spent the last 24 hours poring over all the surveillance footage from the airport security cameras, looking for any suspicious passengers leaving without any luggage. But nothing had jumped out at him. He'd also interviewed a bunch of airport employees who would have been in the baggage claim area on the day the body was found, but none of them had noticed anything strange either. And so, despite it only having been one day since this woman was found, Ravens was already worried that this case was going to go cold. But what Ravens had not counted on was the huge amount of publicity his Jane Doe would generate. The TV news, as well as the newspapers, were reporting feverishly on the body that was found in the LAX suitcase. And by Wednesday, so 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had made it all the way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinoza contacted authorities to report that the body might actually belong to his wife. Officials in Peru called the LAPD, and Juan's report ended up on Ravens' desk. Ravens opened up that report and began reading. Juan and his wife lived in Peru's capital city of Lima, but his wife had been trying to leave Peru to escape poverty. She had left their home hoping to basically sneak into the United States so she could get a job there and then send money back to her family in Peru. She had promised Juan that she would contact him when she arrived in America, but after she left, Juan said he never heard from her. This report felt like a promising lead to Ravens. Juan and his wife checked a lot of boxes, especially because, Ravens' Jane Doe had features that indicated she could be from a South American country like Peru. And so Ravens wondered if Juan's wife had tried to get into America by using a human smuggler, which is someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally. Human smuggling was obviously an unregulated industry, and Ravens knew smugglers could be very violent or reckless, and the people they were transporting often had no protection. Meaning, sometimes when people would go to these smugglers to try to get help to go to these other countries, sometimes the smuggler wouldn't help them. They would just rob them, or in some cases, rob them and then kill them and dispose of their body. And unfortunately, again, because there's no regulation or oversight, a lot of times these horrible crimes would just go unnoticed. And so maybe if that's what had happened to Ravens' Jane Doe, it would explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. The smuggler who committed this crime would not have wanted to leave any ID on or around the body that could be traced back to them. And so Ravens picked up his phone to call the LAX airport operations manager to see if he could get the logs for any flights coming from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. And that was when he discovered there was a big problem with this theory, because there were no flights from Peru. The only flights that day that used the luggage carousel where the body was found were from Korea, Japan, and Germany. And there weren't any flights that originated in Peru that had layovers in those countries either, which meant it just wasn't possible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And so now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no evidence to go on. All he really had was the suitcase and the body. And the actual crime scene itself was maybe somewhere in Korea or Japan or Germany. And so Ravens really didn't have a good idea of where he should begin looking for more evidence. But then he got an idea. Detective Ravens got up from his desk and headed straight to the evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable gloves, and he found the box that contained evidence from Jane Doe's case, and he opened it up. And there really wasn't much. All that was in there were, pieces of jewelry and some clothing that were found on the woman's body. And all of it had already been examined for trace evidence like blood or hair. However, blood and hair were not what Ravens was looking for. One at a time, he lifted out each of the sealed plastic bags that contained Jane Doe's belongings until he got to her blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and he turned it over in his hands and then checked inside the neckband. And there he found exactly what he was looking for. Immediately, he felt a rush of adrenaline. He was onto something here. And so he reached back into the box and he grabbed another plastic bag with a pair of gray pants in it. And he did the same thing. He looked at the waistband. Then he opened a third bag and he checked inside of her blouse. And each time, his hunch had been right. Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them. And the labels were clearly written in some language that was not English. Ravens wasn't sure, but to him, he thought maybe the letters looked Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of Jane Doe's clothing. All of it had been made in the Middle East, in Iran. This meant that finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. But he also had another problem now. Really, he had the same problem he'd had when he thought his victim was from Peru. And that was that there were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on. And none of them originated in Iran. and there were no connecting flights from Iran that day either. And so Ravens needed the public's help. On Thursday, so 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down with a reporter from the city's newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that's read all over the world. And Raven and this other detective's goal was, to give as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that somebody somewhere would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward. However, that's not really how the interview played out. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged by all the questions he and his partner just couldn't answer. In fact, the last thing he said to the reporter, which ended up getting printed as the sort of last line of the story, the lasting impression, if you will, was, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office and had barely taken off his coat when his phone rang. A police officer from Sacramento, California was on the other line, and he sounded all worked up. He told Ravens that he knew that, the LA investigators had been working on the airport Jane Doe case, and even though it wasn't going anywhere, he knew it was a big deal for them. But he told Ravens that he actually had this unbelievable development in Northern California that was connected to the airport Jane Doe case. He said authorities in Northern California had just found another body. But when Ravens heard this, his first reaction was not excitement that there was new evidence or something. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He needed to find his Jane Doe's name. And so he asked the Sacramento officer, what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase or something? But the Sacramento officer said no. The body belonged to a man, and this guy's name had never even been on police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound, 400 miles away from Raven's Jane Doe, but the officer said that the story they had uncovered behind this new body would likely solve Raven's Jane Doe case. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Ravens. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been found at LAX, a man named Hadi had picked up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi, at the Sacramento airport, which is about 400 miles north of LAX. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who'd been away for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Mahmoud was always very optimistic and fun to be around. But on this day, when Mahmoud got in his car, Hadi immediately noticed that his friend seemed sullen and quiet and just very clearly upset about something. And so Hadi asked him what was wrong. And Mahmoud just said, "Oh, I'm sick with the flu." But to Hadi, Mahmoud did not look very sick. He looked worried and kind of jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive, he kept looking out the windows and out the back of the car, like he was nervous about somebody following them or something. And when they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to bed. And for the next 2 days, Mahmoud continued acting increasingly weird and paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment and said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He also kept looking out the windows of their apartment, but whenever Hadi asked what was wrong, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, so now 3 days after Hadi picked Mahmoud up from the airport, Hadi woke up to the sound of the front door of his apartment opening and then shutting. So it felt way too early for Hadi or Mahmoud to be up, and they also lived in a city where break-ins were unfortunately not uncommon. So the sound of the door opening was enough for Hadi to get out of bed and go make sure everything was okay. But when he got to the door, he did not find an intruder or something. He found Mahmoud in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend, where are you going? But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was simply going out. And so there was really nothing Hadi could do. I mean, he couldn't stop Mahmoud from going out, so he watched his friend leave, and then Hadi went back to bed. But as he was in bed, he had this sick feeling in his stomach that something bad was about to happen. About 2 hours later, somebody called the Sacramento Police Department to report finding a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a parking lot. The dead man had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and on the passenger seat next to the body were 2 Iranian passports and 1 Lufthansa Airlines plane ticket. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens the story, he said he believed that one of the passports that were found in the car with the body belonged to Raven's Jane Doe. He said he would send it over that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive ID. And when the passport did arrive, Ravens was able to finally give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud's apartment, they would find another piece of evidence that would actually explain why Katan Safawi had ended up beaten and pummeled and asphyxiated to death in an abandoned tan suitcase in LAX. The evidence was a little bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on January 7th, 1985, Mahmoud very nervously dropped off the tan suitcase that contained Katan at the international airport and then boarded a Lufthansa flight to LAX. He was traveling from Frankfurt, Germany, one of the 3 cities that had flights into LAX that day that specifically used the carousel where the body was found. But Mahmoud's trip had not started in Frankfurt. It had started in Iran. But his travel plans had gotten all messed up and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days. And so this was him finally getting out. But he was insanely nervous about this leg of the trip because of what was in his suitcase. He had expected to feel much less worried once he had successfully checked the suitcase and got his ticket and boarded his flight. But when he did all that, and when his plane took off, Mahmoud only got more and more anxious. Every time the plane hit even the tiniest amount of turbulence, he wanted to scream from the anxiety. But finally, the flight landed at LAX, and as soon as it touched down, Mahmoud got off as fast as he could and practically sprinted to the baggage carousel where he would pick up his suitcase and then board another flight to Sacramento. But when he got to baggage claim and he picked up his suitcase, he knew immediately something was wrong. With a shaking hand, he unzipped the suitcase. And when he looked inside, he felt a wave of grief and horror that was so powerful he almost fainted right there. Because the trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, that he was returning home from now, was a journey to his home country of Iran to get married to the woman he loved, Katan. And now, inside the suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife, Katan, who Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle into America to start their new life together. Katan had run into issues with her visa in Frankfurt, and officials wouldn't let her board the plane to America. And so Katan and Mahmoud tried for days to fix this problem, but it became clear that only Mahmoud would be able to actually enter the United States, not Katan. And so ultimately, Katan willingly got into that suitcase. Mahmoud had not murdered her, or at least not intentionally so. She hadn't been trafficked or anything. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that they would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane, and that's how they would get her to the United States. But during the flight, when she had boarded, she had been totally alive. But when she was in the cargo hold, other luggage had fallen and piled on top of her and slowly crushed her to death. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened up the suitcase and saw what had happened, he panicked. He pulled the tags off the suitcase and left the suitcase and just got on his flight to Sacramento. And then once he landed there, he was so overcome with guilt and grief that 3 days later, he took his own life. When police searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip to America. And those photos were of his and Katan's wedding. The following week, Mahmoud and Katan's bodies were sent back to Iran via the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles. But this time, they traveled together. The next story is called Cold and Calculating. On the morning of December 11th, 1960, a 27-year-old man named Leonid Rogozov stood on the deck of a Soviet ship that was sailing across a freezing ocean at the very bottom of the world. Up ahead, finally, he could see the enormous, desolate white landmass of Antarctica, a continent that was too brutally cold for human civilization to last at scale. Basically, nobody lived there except for like a handful of scientists and other people who were researching the area, like Leonid. Antarctica was about to be Leonid's home for the next year and a half. And Leonid, he looked around him on the deck of the ship at the other 11 men who made up his team, and he smiled. They were all part of what was called the 6th Soviet Antarctic Expedition, and they'd been sailing for 36 days, all the way from Leningrad, Russia, to get here. Their job was to get to Antarctica, disembark, and then travel nearly 50 miles inland over brutal terrain, where they would eventually build a brand new scientific research facility from the ground up, and then they would stay there and begin studying the local climate. Leonid and the rest of the men had been chosen for this expedition because they all had specific skills that the team needed. Leonid was a meteorologist and also knew how to drive this special all-terrain vehicle that they'd brought on the ship. There were a few other meteorologists on the team, as well as several engineers and other scientists, and also one of the men was a doctor. Their work was part of a larger Cold War-era effort by the Soviet government to expand scientific research and knowledge. So Leonid saw this job both as a way of having this big adventure and also as a way of serving his country. And so he ultimately felt proud to be here. But as he was actually looking at the vast emptiness of Antarctica right in front of him for the first time, the reality of the situation they were in began to dawn on him, and he began to feel a jolt of fear. Everything on this expedition had to go exactly right, or he and the other men's lives would be in danger. I mean, this is not a safe place for people. They were arriving in a place with literally zero infrastructure, and they only had about 2 months before the polar winter was going to hit Antarctica, which meant they had to construct the entire research facility and make sure it was polar winter proof in those first 2 months, because that was their shelter. And just to make the stakes clear, if they didn't get it done in time, or if the structure was flawed in some way, they would almost certainly die. When the polar winter came, temperatures would drop as low as negative 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And the ocean would literally freeze solid. The closest help would be about 1,000 miles away and could take weeks or even months to arrive. And their only way to contact the outside world was with this long-range radio that was not always reliable. So essentially, Leonid and these 11 other men that made up this expedition, they were going to be completely isolated, with nobody to rely on except each other, until their scheduled pickup, which was in April of 1962. Again, a year and a half later. So now, when their ship docked on the coast of Antarctica, and the captain called out for everyone to start unloading the ship, Leonid hesitated, and so did some other men. I mean, this was it. This was the real start. But one at a time, they began grabbing their supplies and climbing down a ramp on the side of the ship. Leonid watched his fellow scientists step onto the snow, and as he did, he sort of shook off his own fear as a moment of weakness. Right now, he needed to be strong. And ultimately, I mean, Leonid was a very strong-willed person. He had been born in a remote village in eastern Siberia, so he knew he could handle the isolation and the extreme cold. He had already done that before. He was also the son of a World War II veteran who had died in combat. And his father had taught him to soldier on at all costs, even under the toughest circumstances. So right now, that's what Leonid did. He soldiered on. He took a deep breath of the ice-cold air, then grabbed his things, walked down the ramp, and stepped onto the snow with the others. And then once they had everything they had packed for the next 16 months off the ship, the crew on board the ship still wished all the men good luck, and then they lifted up the ramp. And then Leonid and the rest of the team watched as that ship began sailing away, leaving them all alone for the first time. At first, things at the new Antarctic Research Center went pretty well. Leonid and the team successfully built the entire research building in time before the polar winter, so when the worst weather came, they were able to hunker down inside and be safe. They'd also set up a whole bunch of atmospheric measurement tools that allowed them to study the Antarctic climate exactly as they wanted to. So by April, so 4 months after getting dropped off by that ship, and now only about a month or so into the 6-month-long polar winter, the men, for the most part, were really just trying to stay warm, conserve their supplies, and gather data. However, they hit their first real snag on the morning of April 29th. Leonid woke up in his bunk that day with a stomachache. When Leonid woke up, he had that pain in his stomach, but he felt nauseous and so weak that he could barely roll over inside of his bed. And this really concerned Leonid, because getting a stomachache back at home was one thing, but getting a stomachache in Antarctica was totally different. For one, there was a huge blizzard going on outside that was making both land and air travel literally impossible, which meant that even if Leonid radioed for help, nobody would be able to get to him for a very long time. And to make matters even worse, at their research station, they didn't have access to most of the regular medical treatments that would have been available back at home. Basically, if this stomachache was anything serious, Leonid could die. As a result, Leonid would basically not allow himself to even consider the possibility that this stomachache was serious. Instead, he told himself that, he must have just eaten something weird. They were all living off of rations of preserved food, and so he figured he must have gotten a bad batch of something, and maybe he just had a mild case of food poisoning. So he dragged himself out of bed and he went to the kitchen for a glass of water to hopefully settle his stomach. But when he got there, he saw two other men, another meteorologist and an engineer, who were sitting at a nearby table having breakfast, and they took one look at Leonid and immediately asked him, like, "Hey, are you okay?" And Leonid didn't want to worry them because, again, like any medical emergency is a huge deal here for everybody. So he quickly forced a smile and said, "Oh yeah, everything's fine." Then Leonid quickly grabbed his glass of water, chugged it down, and made his way back to his bunk. And when he got there, he didn't just climb back in bed. Instead, he grabbed some clean clothes and a towel and then walked down the hallway to the shower stalls. And he turned one on as hot as it would go and then got inside. However, before he could even wash his hair, his vision began to go blurry around the edges and his ears began to ring. He felt like he was about to faint, and he quickly sat down on the floor of the shower so he wouldn't fall and hurt himself. And as he was sitting there with his head spinning and the hot water raining down on him, the dull, aching pain in his stomach suddenly sharpened. It was like a horrible, stabbing pain ripping through his stomach now. Leonid barely had time to wrap a towel around his waist and rush to a toilet before he began to vomit. A few minutes later, Leonid stumbled into a small storage closet where the research team kept a reserve of basic medications like pain relievers and antibiotics. Leonid took some antibiotics and tried to power through the day, but that pain in his abdomen just got more and more intense. Eventually, he told the other men on his team that he really had to stop, lie down, and rest, that something was wrong here, but maybe if he just lays down long enough, it'll go away. Leonid would spend the entire evening going back and forth from his bed to the toilet because he kept vomiting, and he didn't sleep at all that night. And by the next morning, April 30th, Leonid was in so much pain that he really couldn't even try to hide it anymore. He was still vomiting, he was still very dizzy to the point where he could barely stand up, and he could tell he was also running a very high fever. However, what really scared Leonid the most was what his belly actually looked like. He had not been able to keep any food down for the last 24 hours, so he knew his stomach was completely empty, and yet he was so bloated that his belly was sticking out like a balloon. And so lying in bed, feeling feverish, nauseous, and dizzy, and looking down at his grotesquely swollen abdomen, Leonid had to admit to himself that this was definitely more than just food poisoning. Something was very wrong, and he needed help. The scientific research team's doctor took stock of all of Leonid's symptoms, and he immediately came up with a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was simple, but the treatment was not. Leonid definitely did not have food poisoning. He was in a life or death situation. This was a very serious thing. But to save him, the doctor was going to have to perform a surgery that had only ever been done successfully 2 times in all of history. And that was because this surgery required a very risky technique that most doctors refused to even try because it was so dangerous, both to the patient and also to the doctor. Basically, Leonid was likely going to die if the doctor attempted the surgery, but Leonid was definitely going to die if he didn't. And so ultimately, a decision was made that the doctor would give it his best try. At least that way, they were trying to save Leonid's life, even if they were unsuccessful. At 2 a.m. that night, so technically early morning on May 1st, the doctor took a deep breath and mentally prepared themselves for this surgery. Leonid was lying on a makeshift operating table inside the research center. He was wearing a surgical gown, and despite the fact he was about to undergo real surgery here, he was wide awake because he had to be. Due to the nature of this incredibly risky and rare surgery, the doctor couldn't actually give Leonid any real anesthesia to knock him out. Leonid had to be wide awake and fully aware for this entire procedure, which meant all he could get were some local anesthetics, which sort of dulled the pain but did not get rid of it. The doctor looked over at the 4 other research team members who were in the operating room. There was a driver, a meteorologist, and 2 aerologists, which are scientists who study the Earth's atmosphere. Now, none of these 4 had any real medical training, but the doctor needed assistance to do this operation, so he'd recruited them to help him out. Leonid had his head propped up with pillows, and his knees were turned to the left, so he was twisted into a position where the lower right side of his abdomen was facing up towards the ceiling. The The doctor had already cut a hole in his hospital gown, so Leonid's swollen stomach was visible. And now, through that hole, the doctor injected Novocaine, which is a type of local anesthetic, right into Leonid's abdomen. And then once the Novocaine took effect, the doctor used a scalpel to carefully make a 4-inch long incision into Leonid's lower abdomen. Leonid took in a sharp breath, but he did his best to stay perfectly still. The incision began to bleed heavily, and one of the assistants came over and used a pair of metal tongs to spread open Leonid's skin and muscles and fat, revealing Leonid's internal organs. At this point, the doctor was so nervous that his hands began to shake, but he took a deep breath and slowly cut his way with the scalpel through the protective membrane that surrounded Leonid's organs. But as he did, he accidentally poked a hole in Leonid's large intestine, and Leonid noticed right away because he began gushing blood. And when the doctor realized what he'd done, he sort of began to panic, and he began yelling for the assistants to hand him his surgical sewing kit. And when they did, he kind of clumsily began trying to sew the hole shut. But by the time the doctor had finally closed up the wound, Leonid had already lost a lot of blood. And the real problem, the reason the doctor was doing this surgery in the first place, still had not been solved. Like, the surgery had not really even happened. We just had this incision, that's it. And so the doctor knew he really had to hurry before Leonid bled out. And so he threw his standard operating procedures out the window. He just had to go for it here. So he just took one of his hands and reached inside of Leonid's abdominal cavity and started literally feeling around, trying to find the source of Leonid's illness. But as he did, it was like all the blood drained out of Leonid's face. I mean, he's feeling this. This must have been horrific. His body went limp and his head kind of rolled back on his pillow. And this was actually the exact moment that this surgery truly became its most dangerous. Not just for Leonid, but for the doctor too. Right as Leonid's head rolled backwards, the doctor felt himself go weak, and suddenly he was seeing stars. And this was because Leonid and the doctor were actually the same person. In addition to being a meteorologist and a driver of that special vehicle, Leonid was also a recent medical school graduate, and he was the one doctor at this research station. So Leonid was performing surgery on himself. He had given himself that Novocaine shot, and then forced himself to stay still as he carved a 4-inch long incision into his own abdomen, accidentally slicing into his intestines that he had the wherewithal to then stitch up as he's bleeding to death, and then he shoved his own hand into his abdominal cavity. But it was at that point that Leonid actually looked like he might die, because he began to show signs like he was going to pass out, likely from blood loss or just shock. But he'd given his assistants specific instruction on what to do if he passed out during the procedure. They were supposed to inject him with a specific drug mixture and then give him CPR until he woke up. But just as one of the assistants readied the needle to inject into Leonid because it did appear like he was about to pass out, Leonid suddenly sucked in a huge breath and his head snapped back up. Leonid, with his hand still inside of his abdomen, told his assistants that he was okay. Then he looked over at the mirror that one of his assistants had been holding up this whole time so that he could see what he was doing during the surgery. And with a combination of the mirror and just sort of feeling around inside of his own body, which must have been horrifically painful, Leonid finally found the thing that was making him so sick. It was his appendix. This entire time, Leonid had been suffering from acute appendicitis. Then he cleaned out his abdominal cavity with antibiotics and then sutured up the entire incision. When he was finally all done, Leonid examined his appendix that he had cut out of himself, and he saw there was this dark, diseased-looking spot right on the bottom of it. Leonid estimated that if he had not removed this thing, it very likely would have burst in less than 24 hours, and that definitely would have killed him. Within just 2 weeks, Leonid was back up on his feet and helping out at the research center like normal. And when the whole team went back home to the Soviet Union in April of 1962, so about a year after Leonid's self-surgery, he was greeted like a hero. The government actually gave him a medal called the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, which was for extraordinary contributions to Soviet society. And he would go down in history as the third person to ever perform a successful auto-appendectomy, and he did it outside of a real hospital with no other trained medical professionals anywhere nearby. And that's actually not the only way that Leonid's legacy lived on. Today, some countries actually require doctors who are stationed in Antarctica to undergo preventative appendectomies, just so that they will never be in a situation like Leonid. Because it turns out, the one thing you really can't bring to Antarctica is your appendix. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today, one night in late August of 1557, a Frenchman in his 30s named Martin Guerre was laying in a bed in a makeshift military hospital in St. Quentin, France, writhing around in pain. So a few weeks earlier, Martin had fought in this massive battle between the French and Spanish armies. And it had been this just horrible, bloody, violent battle. And during it, Martin had been wounded very severely. In fact, he had lost his leg. Now, this injury was obviously just devastating and very painful, but Martin also knew he was just lucky to be alive here. The doctors who had treated him at one point had seemed certain that he was going to die. So Martin and his doctors were all very surprised when he didn't die and he pulled through and survived. And Martin knew that a lot of his comrades who'd already left St. Quentin by this point and moved on with the army or gone back home, they very likely thought that he had died, given how bad it looked. But he was alive and in a lot of pain. And really more than that, he was just sort of devastated. I mean, he was incredibly lonely. All of his army mates had basically left the hospital or just moved on with their careers or they'd gone home. And he was still here, unable to leave the hospital. And he has this injury too. He hasn't really gotten used to life without the use of his leg. And so his whole world has come crashing down. He's sort of by himself. All he has is the few army doctors who periodically come over and check on him, but beyond those people, he was just isolated and sort of trapped with these awful thoughts in his head 24/7. And eventually, these spiraling thoughts became really like the worst thing he was dealing with. They surpassed the actual physical pain he was dealing with. It was just this incredible depression that had set in. So Martin, he had grown up in the small rural village in southern France called Artigas. And he had gotten married at a very young age to a woman named Bertrande, and they had loved each other very much, and they had a son together. However, Martin had sort of completely messed up his life when he stole some grain from his father and had to literally flee town. Stealing, especially from a family member at the time, was not only criminal, but really quite shameful. And Martin had been so afraid of what people would say and what they would think of him that he decided not to face them at all. And he just left Artigas, leaving behind Bertrande and his son and his whole life. Now, initially, after he had sort of run away, he had considered going back and just saying he was sorry and accepting whatever punishment he'd be given. But he was always too scared to do it, and so he just didn't. And then before long, he got caught up in this war, and then years had passed by. It's like he's basically just gone. He's been removed from Bertrande and his son's life. He's just out of their lives. He's left them. And now, he's had his leg blown off. And in his mind, in this depressed state he was in, now, he had never really stopped thinking about his former life. He missed his wife terribly, but he's thinking to himself, I'm not the person she married. I'm a different person. I'm a degraded, bad person. She wouldn't even want to be with me at this point. And then beyond Bertrand and his son, and how they would look at him, he also was thinking that he was this thief, this shameful person that the rest of the village would not welcome back. So in his mind, he really felt not just isolated in this hospital, with no army mates nearby, stuck because of this injury, but he's also thinking, I don't even have a place in the world. I have nothing. My life is ruined. And so as Martin lay in the hospital bed, having these horrible thoughts and feeling all this physical pain in his leg, just having this horrible time, he found his mind wandering to somebody else in his life that had been very important to him. His friend Arnaud. He just wished if there was one person that he could talk to right now, it would be him. So Arnaud was a fellow soldier. And before this really horrible battle where Martin lost his leg, the two had been great friends and they bonded because they had a lot in common. They were both from small towns in the south of France, and they even looked the same, they could pass as brothers. So they'd gotten really close and they talked about their lives and they shared a lot with one another. But like everyone else in the military that Martin had been friendly with or just worked with, Arnaud had, moved on. He was no longer here. He had gone somewhere else, wherever the army sent him. And so Arnaud was just yet another person in his life who he wished he could spend more time with, but knew he wouldn't. And so Martin's recovery would take a very long time. He was stuck in a hospital, basically bedridden with these horrible thoughts and this awful pain for weeks and then months, and then years passed by, and Martin still was just a shell of himself. And so he actually was moved to hospice care. However, after getting to hospice, Martin actually didn't die. Typically hospice care is for people that are at the end of life and that no longer is it about trying to save them, it's about keeping them comfortable until they pass away. But for Martin, he didn't die. He actually got better. And one afternoon in early September of 1560, so now about 3 years or so after he had lost his leg, Martin sat on a bench outside of the hospice that he had been staying in since the war had ended. Now, where he was located was actually just, a few miles from his hometown, Artigas. But despite the now close proximity to, his former life, if you will, to Martin, it felt like, Artigas could have been a million miles away. It couldn't have felt further away for him. So after Martin sort of miraculously healed inside of hospice care and he was outfitted with a wooden prosthetic leg and was told that he could now leave and go about his life, well, it was good on the one hand. He got to go, back into reality, but he still had a lot of health problems as a result of his injuries. And, given this treacherous stretch of time where he had just been stuck in bed having these horrible thoughts, he had completely convinced himself that truly he was a shell of the man he used to be, and that nobody from his previous life would want him, not his wife, not his son, not anybody. He was nothing now. And so even though Martin was better at this point, in his mind, he sort of had resigned himself to simply wasting away and dying all alone. He just figured, even though the doctors say I'm better, that's the path I'm on, and I'm not going to change it. But now, as Martin sat outside on this bench, he heard a voice. And when he looked over at the road in front of the hospice where he heard this voice, he saw there was a man that he had never met before who was clearly walking towards him, that was the person speaking to him. As the man approached Martin, he asked him, "Are you Martin Guerre?" And when Martin slowly nodded, saying, "Yes, I am," this man's face lit up and he explained that he'd been looking all over for him. He said he'd been sent here on behalf of Martin's family back in Artigas, and he wanted to bring Martin back to them. When Martin heard this, he couldn't believe it. He really was so convinced that he was just destined for a life of shame and agony until he died. And now to hear that his family wants him back, they're looking for him, this was incredible. This was unbelievable. He really assumed he would never go home again. And now here was this guy saying, "Come with me, let's go home." However, before Martin could ask any follow-up questions, of which he had many, about his family and what they asked about him, that kind of thing, the man told Martin that actually he had been sent here to get Martin and he was going to bring him home, but first, they needed to stop at the courthouse in a city called Toulouse. Martin looked at him "What do you mean?" And the man explained the reason behind it, and Martin simply couldn't believe what he was being told. A few days later, on the morning of September 12th, Martin climbed out of a wagon in front of the courthouse in Toulouse, a city about 40 miles away from Artigas. And Martin, he felt butterflies in his stomach as he, used his cane to climb the court steps to get up to the front doors. And then when he got up there, he took a deep breath, threw open the double doors, and stepped inside. And the instant he did, the first thing he saw is the entire courthouse was filled with people, and they all turned to look at him, and everyone's speaking with these hushed voices like, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it." And that's when Martin realized he had just walked directly in to the middle of a trial. And so Martin, for a second, he just stood there staring back at all these people who were turned to look at him, and he realized that he recognized many of their faces. He saw some of his friends, he saw his uncle Pierre and some of his sisters. He saw his wife, Bertrand, as well as a boy sitting next to her, who must have been his son. And all of these people, they're looking at Martin with just looks of absolute shock on their faces. Like they were completely stunned to see him, and they're all looking at his wooden leg, and they're looking back at him. It was like they couldn't believe he had just walked in here. However, before Martin could really, fully appreciate the emotional moment he was having here, seeing his loved ones after over a decade, he first looked towards the front of the courthouse. And as soon as Martin saw what was up there, he knew that what that man had told him, who came up to him on the bench in front of the hospice, was true. And Martin had to bite his lip to keep from screaming. It would turn out Martin was wrong to believe that, his wife and the town of Artigas would never accept him back, that he was worthless and should never return. Because his wife Bertrand and the town of Artigas actually did welcome him back. Or so they thought. Because when Martin walked into that courthouse and looked towards the front of the room, what he saw was his long-lost buddy Arnaud from the war. And Arnaud was on trial. Arnaud did not just look like he could be Martin's brother. He looked exactly like Martin. And since Arnaud really had been very disliked in his own hometown for being a con artist, he wanted a fresh start in a new place after he left the army. So, years earlier, while Martin was lying in a makeshift army hospital so badly injured that doctors were telling him he was almost certainly going to die, while that was happening, his best bud, Arnaud, was using their likeness and his knowledge of Martin's life from all the times that Martin had confided in his friend to literally steal Martin's life. Arnaud had waltzed into Artigas and told everyone there that he was Martin Guerre. And the entire town not only believed him, they celebrated his return. Arnaud was actually so convincing that even Bertrand had believed Arnaud was her husband, and she had gone on to have 2 additional children with him, believing this was Martin. However, one person, Martin's uncle, Pierre, he just didn't buy it. He thought this guy was a fake. He thought he was an imposter, and he took him to court for fraud. And that trial was why the man had tracked Martin down at the hospice and brought him to Toulouse to help prove to everyone there that, look, Arnaud's an imposter because here's the real Martin. And of course, it worked, because when Martin stepped into that courtroom and his own family laid eyes on him, the actual Martin Guerre, they realized right away that Arnaud truly was a fake. Arnaud was ultimately sentenced to death and hanged in front of Martin's house in Artigas while the entire village watched. As for Bertrand, Martin's wife, she was horrified to learn that she had not recognized her own husband and that she had had 2 kids with a stranger. She begged Martin to forgive her, but he never did. Our second and final story today is called Layers. One morning in November of 1940, an 84-year-old prospector named Irwin Robertson hiked down a snowy ridge in the Alaskan wilderness. He was pushing this sled that was full of supplies and animal furs, and it was pretty hard. I mean, as he was pushing this thing along, he was working so hard that he was breathing really heavy, and even though it was really cold outside, He could feel himself sweating underneath his clothes, like he was going to be covered in sweat. Now, Erwin knew that what he was doing was, risky. I mean, after all, he certainly was not as young as he used to be, and you don't want to get hurt out here or, totally exhaust yourself out here. I mean, this is the wild. But Erwin was not about to slow down because he could just not wait to get home. So Erwin had come to this area about 40 years earlier as part of the big Alaskan gold rush. And so, like basically every other prospector, he spent every summer and every fall at a cabin up in the mountains, predominantly hunting and mining. But his real home, where he really considered where he lived, was in the pioneer town of Eagle, Alaska, where he lived during the winter and the spring. And that is where Erwin was headed this morning. He had just wrapped up a very successful fall season up in the mountains, and he'd actually intended on staying in the cabin up in the mountains a bit longer. But a few days ago, the temperature had suddenly dropped, and Erwin did not have the supplies to wait out a winter storm up in that cabin. So he had packed up his things, told the handful of other prospectors in the area where he was going, and then he set out for Eagle. Now, this was a 100-mile trek to get to his home in Eagle, and it was through some very rough terrain, and also he's in Alaska, so this is like a very rough area to be navigating. But Erwin had made the trip at least once a year for the past 4 decades, so he knew what he was doing. So, despite really exerting himself here pushing the sled, he kept up as hard of a pace as he could manage for the next couple of hours, and then finally, around midday, he allowed himself to slow down and just take a quick break. However, after stopping and reaching into his parka and pulling out his canteen to take a sip of water, as he's sipping the canteen, something catches his attention out of the corner of his eye. And even though all he saw was just like a flash of movement out in the trees, he knew immediately what it was. So during this trek so far, there was this pack of wolves that was following him. He knew they were following him. But again, this is a man who lived in the wilds of Alaska, and so he was not unaccustomed to running into packs of wolves. He knew they were quite dangerous, especially for a guy who's alone in the woods right now. But he wasn't that concerned. However, he's thinking, okay, they're right over there. I'm going to take a very quick break. He, capped his canteen, put it back in his parka, and he's like, I'm going to keep on moving here. A few hours later, Erwin was a good ways further down the ridge, but he was starting to get cold. In fact, ice had formed on his beard and on his eyelashes. So the temperature had dropped much faster than he had expected, and he was starting to get worried because he knew it was only going to get much worse after the sun went down. And remember, he's been exerting himself this whole time. He's been sweating under his clothes, so he's wet under his clothes. And now the temperature's dropping, so he's like getting really, really cold. And so he decided that it was in his best interest to actually just stop right now and build a fire and just make sure he was warm. And so Erwin, he continued pushing his sled, keeping his eyes peeled for a good spot to actually stop and make camp. But as he's moving along, he hears something that causes him to just stop. It wasn't the sound of wolves. It was the sound of trickling water. And much like the wolves, water was quite dangerous out in the wilds of Alaska. But in many ways, water, especially in a very cold environment like this, was like the most lethal to people. Because getting fully wet in these temperatures basically guaranteed you would freeze to death. So Erwin moved very cautiously forward because, again, all he can do is hear the trickling water. He doesn't know where it is, and he's thinking, I better be careful I don't accidentally step into a creek or something and get wet here. He's already wet from sweating underneath his clothes. He can't afford to get more wet, and so he's moving carefully and cautiously. And then he rounds a bend, and he actually sees the source of the sound. It was a creek that had basically completely frozen over, with the exception of a little bit of water that was sort of leaking out and sort of spilling out over the ice itself. And over time, this water that was making the sound and leaking out, it was sort of freezing in layers on the surface of this creek. And so it was kind of like this moundy block of ice that was sitting on top of this creek, but you could clearly see water sort of trickling its way through it. And so when Erwin saw this, he realized that, as long as he was very careful to avoid stepping on the frozen creek itself, that this area would actually make a great spot to spend the night. He could refill his canteen from the little spout of water coming out of the creek. Plus, there were a bunch of dead trees nearby, which were perfect for firewood. And this was good news, because by this point, Erwin was so cold he was shivering. So he parked his sled and then began gathering up some firewood. But as he was going around doing this, he spotted a few of those wolves who had not stopped following him, not very far away from him. They were sort of lingering in the trees, clearly watching him. And for the first time, Erwin started to feel pretty anxious about these wolves. The fact that they were now even closer than the last time he saw them suggested that, one, they're still following him, but two, they're getting braver, they're getting closer. But Erwin's thinking, I can't just continue on here. As much as it makes sense to get away from the wolves, I'm beat physically and I'm soaked. My clothes are wet. I'm getting so cold. I'm going to die of hypothermia if I'm not careful. I got to start this fire. I have to make camp here. I just have to. About 20 minutes later, Erwin had gathered up all the wood that he would need, and he piled it all next to his sled, and then he got ready to start his fire. And in this kind of very cold environment, actually starting the fire, the process of igniting the fire, was a potentially very dangerous process. Because in order to light the match, to light the fire, Erwin would have to take off his mittens and expose his hands to the freezing cold. But Erwin had to do it, so he reached down and he bit one of his mittens and pulled it off with his teeth, and then with that hand he reached into his parka and he pulled out his fire kit, which contained these thin scraps of tinder that he would use as fire-starting material. Then he grabbed a match and he struck it to light it, but it didn't catch. The head of the match did not catch on fire. And so Erwin tried again, striking the match once more, but it didn't light. And again, he just kept trying over and over, and eventually he just snapped the match in half. Now, Erwin didn't panic because he knew that, in extreme cold, some matches light better than others, and some don't even light at all. And he had seen this happen before, so he wasn't panicking. Instead, he pulled off his other mitten to make sure he had max dexterity here, and he took out the other match and he held the thing he was striking it against, and he struck this second match, thinking this one will light. But it didn't, and he tried again and again, and he's starting to get a little panicked when finally he strikes the match, and this one does catch. But by this point, he's now had his naked hands exposed to the unbelievably cold temperatures for over a minute, and his hands were starting to seize up from the cold. They were shaking, in fact, so badly from the cold that even though he's got this light, his hands shook so much that by the time he transferred it to the tinder, the shaking caused it to extinguish. It was out. And at this point, Erwin did start to panic because his hands are in so much pain and they're so stiff from the cold that he was afraid that even if he put his mittens back on his hands, they wouldn't warm up fast enough for him to then remove his mitten and try this whole fire thing again. He really needed the fire in order to warm his hands, but obviously he needs his hands to make the fire. And so he's got a problem here. So Erwin, who was not one to give up easily, he just gritted his teeth and with his, failing hands, he just reached down and, fumbled and grabbed a third match, thinking, I gotta light this one. I gotta start this fire to warm my hands up, to warm my whole body up. I gotta do this. And so he's got this third match. He's barely able to hold it. And it took all his focus just not to drop it. But finally, he managed to scrape it against the side of this matchbook. And to his relief, it did catch. And so immediately, Erwin, very carefully, kind of sheltered this little flame, and he carried it over to the tinder, and he put the flame on the tinder, but nothing happened. Erwin waited for the bundle to catch fire, but it didn't. And then the flame, the match, just burned out. And for a long moment, Erwin just stared at this scene in front of him in confusion. He didn't understand because he knew that this time he had done it all right. He had lit the match, he put it on the tinder. He had done this so many times before, but it's just not working. But then he looked more closely at the tinder, and his heart just sank because he knew that the situation he was in was truly catastrophic. Several days later, there were some people living in Eagle, Alaska, who noticed that Erwin was not in Eagle. He had not arrived. And it didn't make any sense because he had told people when he would be there, and there was no reason he would be late unless something happened. And so these folks were just concerned enough that they went to authorities, and by November 19th, which is almost exactly a week after Erwin had struggled to light that fire, the U.S. Marshal's Office was out in force looking for Erwin. And so on November 19th, a deputy from the U.S. Marshal's Office who was out in the wilderness, a part of this search, He and his team came through these trees and he saw this clearing up ahead, and he noticed there was something in the middle of it. It was a sled that was surrounded by supplies, and it was set up on the bank of a frozen creek. And so immediately the deputy thought, like, this could be Irwin's sled. He could be nearby. And so he and his men, they rush down to this sled and they look around and they see there's like a rifle propped up against a tree, and there's this stack of unused firewood, and there's all this tinder and a bunch of matches that are strewn about on the ground that also don't appear to have been used. But beyond these supplies and these things they're seeing, there was nothing else, like Irwin was not here. However, the longer the deputy stood there just looking around, the more he realized what actually must have happened to Irwin. Because after sort of doing an initial scan, he realized there was something else in this clearing that he hadn't noticed at first. Wolf tracks. The deputy told his men that, very likely Irwin has been killed and carried off by wolves here, so follow these tracks and see if we can recover Irwin's body. And so the search party set out to go look. However, pretty quickly, they realized that, as they're following these tracks, that something just seemed off here. It seemed obvious, given that Irwin had not shown up yet. He's been found, his stuff's all here, he's not here, and there's these tracks here. It seemed obvious that he must have been killed by wolves, but they don't see any blood anywhere. Like, wouldn't he have been attacked by his stuff? And there'd be signs of an attack, and then he's been, dragged off. There should be a trail of blood or something. Any indication that a struggle happened, but no, it was just tracks, nothing else. And so eventually, as the deputy and his men are just following these tracks sort of farther and farther away from the sled and what they had found near the creek, they stopped and they're like, hold on a minute, something doesn't add up here. Let's go back and take another look at the actual site where the sled was, because again, there's no evidence of an actual wolf attack. There's just evidence of wolves. And so they turn around and they follow the wolf tracks back to where the sled is, and they start looking around more closely for, maybe there is some sign of a wolf attack that they missed, and they're looking around, and they eventually spot what appeared to be Irwin's tracks. And they began following these, thinking that, maybe Irwin had become hypothermic and confused and wandered off into the woods, and either he died out there or had been attacked out there by wolves, but, let's follow these, and this is bound to lead us to wherever Irwin went. But the footprints, they only led away from the sled a few feet before doubling back and stopping right at the edge of this frozen creek. And so for a minute, the deputy's looking down, trying to make sense of how these tracks just stop right here. Did they miss something? Where did Irwin go? But then the deputy just literally looked at the creek, towards the center of this frozen creek, which to that point he hadn't really been focusing on. It was all the things on the land. Now he's looking at the creek itself, and suddenly he knew what happened to Irwin. So a week earlier, on the night that Irwin is trying to start this fire, he's desperate, he's becoming hypothermic, the wolves are nearby, he finally strikes that third match, he gets it to light, but the tinder won't light, because the tinder was wet. We can assume the reason it was wet is because he kept his fire kit inside of his parka, and he was working so hard with that sled, he was sweating so much that he sweat on the tinder, and he soaked it. And so now he does not have a way to start a fire. He cannot make fire. Without fire, he is going to freeze to death. There's no two ways about it. He is a veteran of the Alaskan wilderness. He knows he's doomed. And worse than that is he knows the wolves are getting closer and closer. And so no longer was it about what do I have to do to survive this thing? No, it became, how do I want to die? And as he listened to the wolves howl not too far away, he thought to himself, I certainly don't want to die by being eaten alive. And so he made a choice. A week later, the deputy from the U.S. Marshal's office was standing by the creek trying to figure out what happened to Irwin, and he looks out and he realizes there is a lump in the middle of the ice, right in the center of the creek, that he had not recognized at first as anything significant, but now he was looking more closely, and he realized it was Irwin. In an effort to avoid being eaten by wolves, Irwin had at some point walked into the middle of the creek, laid down on his back right in that break in the creek where that little bit of water was trickling out, that he had filled up his canteen right there, and he had just laid there, and the water kept spilling out onto him and gradually froze in layers over his whole body, essentially freezing himself into this cocoon in the creek. And so eventually he had frozen to death inside of the creek, but the ice had kept the wolves away. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and Andrew Kelleher. Story editing by Evan Allen and by Luke Baratz. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories about people who made grave mistakes. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The New Member, and it's about a group of church members who witness something horrifying as their pastor begins a ceremony. At 10:30 a.m. on October 30th, 2005, a 33-year-old pastor named Kyle Lake stood on a stage inside of the University Baptist Church in Waco, Texas. Kyle had just finished delivering that morning's sermon to his congregation, which included about 800 people. And now he was about to welcome a new member, a young woman. So Kyle had been the pastor of this church for the last 7 years. And over that time, the church had really grown and evolved, really directly because of Kyle's leadership. He was known as being a very thoughtful and educated pastor, who was also known to be quite fun and progressive. He often would play pranks on the congregation and keep things really light, even if he was in the middle of a very important sermon. And people liked that. It made him relatable. And so because of Kyle's youthful energy that he clearly gave off, he had sort of gradually shifted the congregation to being a much more young crowd. Predominantly the folks who attended the church were college kids, or roughly that age. And also his wife was an attendee at the church, as were his 3 little kids, who at the moment, as he was up on stage, they were across the hall attending kids' Bible study. Now for Kyle, welcoming a new member into this church had become a very big deal for him. He in fact had this special ceremony he would perform for each and every new member. And really the whole congregation got behind this ceremony. And so today, Kyle was about to do this ceremony with this new member, this young woman. And so Kyle, in front of the whole congregation, he calls this woman up, come on up, we're gonna do the ceremony to welcome you to the church. And so the woman, she gets up and she walks up to the front of the stage, she smiles, and Kyle says hello to her and sort of introduces himself, and the whole church is listening. And then Kyle, as part of this ritual, moved to the very center of the stage, where the actual ceremony was going to take place. And he was about to call the woman up to join him in the center of the stage when there was a malfunction. Now, the malfunction itself was not really a huge deal. All it did was just stop Kyle for a second, and he had to stop talking to the new member, and he had to figure out what he was going to do, but quickly he saw a fix that didn't even require him to leave the stage. However, the instant he actually made the fix, when he fixed the malfunction, as he was about to start talking to the whole audience again, he just began to scream. Now, at first, nobody took this seriously because their pastor was known for playing pranks on the congregation. And so everybody just thought it was a prank, albeit a strange one. I mean, he's screaming at the top of his lungs, but everyone's sort of looking around like, this is a prank, right? But then Kyle's screams began to include words. He began screaming, "Help! Help me!" And at that point, it sort of clicked for the whole congregation that this was not a joke. Something was terribly wrong. Even though they're looking up at him and nothing appeared to be wrong. Nothing made sense. And so immediately it was like the church spiraled into chaos and confusion. People are bowing their heads, praying as fiercely as they could, praying for his safety. Others are sprinting out of the church, not even knowing what to do. And still more were calling 911, like several people calling 911. And then by the time the paramedics showed up, it was like people still had no idea what actually was happening. In fact, honestly, the paramedics didn't. It was like, what is this? But within a few days, they were able to figure out what happened, and it surprised everyone. So the special ceremony that Kyle would perform for every new member was a baptism. And so when Kyle moved to the very center of the stage and he actually called up the woman to join him in the center of the stage, he actually was stepping into the baptismal pool. Picture like a hot tub, waist-high water, it's warm water, and so Kyle literally stepped into the hot tub and he's calling up this woman to join him in the pool so she can be baptized. However, before this woman actually got to the pool, Kyle has this malfunction. And all it was is his lapel mic shut off. It wasn't working anymore. And because the church he was in was huge and cavernous, sound really didn't travel well. He needed a microphone to project his voice, and so he had to stop the ceremony for a second and find another microphone. Luckily, there was a stand with a microphone in it right within arm's reach, and so Kyle grabbed it. However, what Kyle didn't know was there actually was a second malfunction that had happened either at this instant or just before, but either way, there was another malfunction that he had no idea about. And that was that the heaters of the baptismal pool that kept the water warm were damaged. And as a result of this damage, the water in that pool had become electrically charged. And so the instant Kyle grabbed that microphone, he grounded the electricity in the pool. Basically, he created a pathway for the electricity to travel through his body. When he began to scream, that was him being electrocuted. Despite the efforts of first responders and the medical staff at the hospital, Kyle unfortunately did not survive. As for Kyle's wife, who literally watched this happen from the front row of the church, she watched her husband be killed. She ultimately sued the electrical company that installed those heaters in the baptismal pool, and she would settle for an undisclosed amount of money. Our next story is called Robin Hood. In the spring of 2020, right when the COVID-19 pandemic was really kicking into high gear, students at the University of Nebraska were told to move out of their dorms and move back home with their families to prevent the spread of the virus. One student, 20-year-old Alex Kearns, who was enrolled at Nebraska on an ROTC scholarship, was just as shocked as everybody else at how quickly this pandemic had turned their life upside down. But in terms of going back home again, he wasn't that upset about it because he was close with his family and he figured some unexpected time with them would be nice. Once he got back to his hometown of Naperville, Illinois, which is an affluent suburb outside of Chicago, he quickly fell into a quarantine routine, which consisted mostly of screen time and lounging around. But in the evenings, he would put his screens away and he would go into the kitchen with his mother Dorothy, and the two of them would chat for hours about all sorts of things. One night, he told his mom that he was feeling kind of nervous about what he was going to do with his life after college. That even though he was studying business out at the University of Nebraska, he didn't really know what he was going to do with that. All he knew was that he wanted to find a way to help people. And his mother and everybody that knew Alex would say that that's just Alex. He was this really gentle, nice, awesome person that everybody just adored. After being home for a few weeks, Alex was starting to get bored of his quarantine routine, and he began looking for other things to do. He had seen a number of ads for a new brokerage app called Robinhood that was becoming increasingly popular amongst people his age. Unlike other trading platforms, Robinhood was designed for the common person. There was not huge fees that needed to be paid by the investor as soon as they logged on, and the app was very sleek, and it turned trading kind of into a game on the app. Alex had a few $1,000s in his bank account, and so he figured, you know what the heck, I'll download Robinhood and see what I can do. What's the worst that can happen? After trading on Robinhood for a couple of days, Alex was hooked, and he showed his family that he was actually making a little bit of money, and he was learning about the stock market. His parents would later recall when they found out he was using Robinhood, they weren't concerned because Alex had always been incredibly careful with his money, saving most of it and very rarely spending much of it. And so they figured, he might lose his savings, but he's certainly not going to fall into significant debt. That's just not Alex. Also, there was a safety mechanism in basic accounts on Robinhood that protected first-time users from going above $10,000 in debt. So even if Alex tried to lose more than that, the app wouldn't allow him so long as he was using a basic account. As the weeks went on, Alex got more and more confident in his trading ability, and he got really familiar with the Robinhood app. And one day he noticed there was one function he had not tried on the app called options trading. For context, traditional trading goes like this. Somebody identifies a stock that they like, and then they gamble on it. And the way they gamble on it is they buy shares of that stock, and if the stock increases in value, they make more money. If the stock loses value, they lose money. Very simple. But some people either can't afford the shares or don't want to buy the shares, but they still want to get in on the action of the stock market. And for those people, they can use something called options trading. Instead of buying shares, options traders will basically sell an insurance policy to other traders who have already purchased shares. And this insurance policy they're offering is known as an option. These option traders will go up to these shareholders and they'll say, for example, I'll give you $500 in exchange if your stock tanks and you're losing a ton of money. You can exercise your option, i.e. cash in your insurance policy, and I, the option holder, will cover all of your losses. But if your stock stays steady or gains in value, I still get to keep your $500. That's non-refundable. Naturally, these options traders, they need to be savvy about which stocks they're prepared to cover with their option. Because if that stock tanks and the shareholder decides to sell, i.e. exercise their option, then the option holder is obligated to immediately buy all of the shares at a premium. And if that shareholder has, let's say, hundreds of thousands of shares, well, too bad, the option holder is buying all of them. So when Alex clicked on the options trading button inside of his Robinhood app, it brought him immediately to an application because Robinhood had to make sure anybody on their app that was going to be buying or selling options, they needed to be an experienced trader and they needed to understand the risks because they were much higher than a basic account. There was no limit to how much debt someone could fall into in trading options. Alex was a smart guy and a motivated trader, but he knew nothing about options trading. And so when he saw this application, I'm sure he thought to himself, yeah, I know nothing about options trading. There's no way I could possibly get into this. But he decided, what the heck? I will apply to go onto their options trading side just to see if they'll accept me. And so he fills out the application and almost immediately he is accepted onto that side of the platform. It would later turn out that application was kind of a sham. It did not really do very much to restrict access to that side. Alex was surprised at his acceptance, but he was also very excited. And right away, he started trading options, and he was pretty good at it. And pretty quickly, he was making a little bit of money. But then on June 11th, he got a notification on his phone from Robinhood. And so he pulled his phone up, he opened the app, and he saw his account was restricted. He couldn't make any new trades, and he couldn't make any withdrawals. And so as he looked at it, he scrolled down to the bottom of the page, and he saw his current balance. And it read negative $730,000. A trader that Alex had sold an option to was exercising his option because his stock had tanked, and he owned over $700,000 worth of shares that now Alex was obligated to buy. Alex couldn't believe what he was looking at, and he immediately fired off an email to Robinhood customer support saying there had to have been a mistake, that he had done the math before he had sold that option, and he thought at most he was exposed to losing maybe $10,000, certainly not $700,000. And so after he sent this email, a couple of minutes later, he got a message back from Robinhood, but it was just an automated response that just said, hey, we got your email and we're busy and we'll be sure to be in touch with you as soon as we possibly can. And so at this point, Alex is starting to panic a little bit because he's looking at his phone and this looks real. He's trying to go through his phone to find some place that would show him this was a mistake, but there's nothing that indicates this is a mistake. And so after a couple of hours, Alex is just laying in his bed, he can't sleep, and he sends another message to the customer support team at Robinhood, pleading with them to please check his account. There has to have been a mistake. There's no way I would have exposed myself to $700,000 of debt. But again, all he gets is an automated response that says, we're busy and we'll be in touch with you soon. A couple hours later at 3:26 a.m., Alex is still awake, probably pacing around his room, totally panic-stricken, and he looks at his phone and there's another email from Robinhood, and he's thinking, oh my goodness, thank you, someone's gotten in touch with me to tell me this has been a horrible mistake. And so he opens his email, and the header of the email is immediate action required. And what it was a notice for him to make his first payment on this enormous debt. It was going to be about $170,000 that he had to pay in the next couple of days. And if he didn't make this first payment, they would seek legal action against him. Alex was probably terrified, and also he was ashamed and didn't want to tell his parents. And so all alone in his room, he writes a third email to Robinhood, now straight up begging them, someone please look at my account. This has got to be wrong. But again, he just got the automated message. And so for the rest of the night, Alex probably laid on his bed thinking the world was just crashing in on him. He knew there was no way he could pay this enormous bill, and if he didn't pay it, he would either go to jail or hand it off to his family, which would financially ruin them. And just the idea of doing that to the people he loved made him sick. He just could not face that as one of his options. And so by the time the sun came up the next morning, Alex had come to a conclusion about what he was going to do. He started by pulling out his phone and pulling up the Robinhood app and screenshotting the dashboard that showed his enormous negative balance. And then he went on his laptop and he wrote a long letter to his family and he put it on his desktop so they would understand why he did what he was about to do. And then he left the house, hopped on his bike, and pedaled away. A couple hours later, a police officer arrived at the Kearns' household, and he told them that their son, their brother, Alex, was unfortunately deceased. He had thrown himself in front of a train. The family was beyond devastated. This caught them so completely off guard, it didn't make any sense. Alex was a happy, funny guy with plans for the future. He had shown no indications that he wanted to harm himself. It really just didn't make any sense. And so at some point that day, they went to his laptop, they opened it up, and there was that note he wrote. And in this letter, he explains to his family how he had fallen into this enormous debt on Robinhood. He attaches the screenshot that showed his huge negative balance. And he said it was just crazy that this company would allow a 20-year-old with no income to be exposed to over $700,000 of debt. He thought that was crazy, but he admitted he didn't know that much about options trading and probably shouldn't have been accepted into their program to begin with. And then he tells his family that he did want to live, but unfortunately, this was the only way he could get out of this problem without inflicting enormous financial penalties on his family. And so he believed he was protecting his family when he took his life. 24 hours later, Robinhood sent Alex another email and it said, "Oh, that $730,000 debt that we said you owed, that was a mistake. You don't owe anybody any money." The next and final story of today's episode is called The Sailor's Diagnosis. One morning in the summer of 1876, a doctor named Lewis Allard walked down the hallway of a hospital in Papeete, Tahiti. Tahiti is an island east of Australia. Lewis was just about to step into his office when he heard the hospital doors open, and he looked over to see a few policemen walking in carrying this unconscious man on a stretcher. Just from the looks of the way this guy was dressed, Dr. Allard could tell he was a sailor. So a lot of Dr. Allard's patients were sailors because Papeete was a port town. So if people got sick or injured at sea and then docked in Papeete, they would come to the hospital right there. So Dr. Allard walked over to the police and asked them what was going on with the sailor. And the officers explained that this man's friends had found him unresponsive that morning, apparently after a very long night of drinking. Dr. Allard nodded and then motioned for the police to follow him and bring this guy with him, and he led them over to an exam room where he had them lay out the sailor on a table so that Dr. Allard could look him over. The sailor appeared to be pretty young. He was in his 20s maybe, and he appeared very healthy and strong. But when the doctor checked for a pulse, there was none. And so after checking a couple more times to make sure it wasn't just a very weak pulse, the doctor ultimately concluded that, this sailor was not just unresponsive. The sailor was dead. And if Dr. Allard had to guess, he very likely died from alcohol poisoning, given his friends said, the night before, this guy had had a really heavy night of drinking, and here he was, so alcohol poisoning. So this hospital had a policy for how to handle the death of foreign sailors in Tahiti. Basically, the doctor who pronounced the sailor dead would then arrange for them to be buried in a public cemetery. And in fact, the hospital kept these cheap wooden coffins in the hospital morgue for this exact purpose. And so Dr. Allard followed protocol and asked the police to go inform the sailor's friends of his death, and then the doctor went to the hospital's morgue to arrange for a coffin. A few hours later, Dr. Allard was back in his office when he heard a knock at his door. He told whoever it was to come in, but when the door swung open, the doctor was surprised at who he saw there. It was the 4 local gravediggers who he had called earlier to bury that sailor who had just died. Now, generally speaking, Dr. Allard had virtually no interactions with the gravediggers after he hired them. He would tell them to bury the body, and they would do that and go on their separate way. Like there was no reason for the gravediggers to come back and check in with the doctor. But as the doctor is looking at these 4 guys trying to figure out what was going on here, he quickly assessed that, these guys weren't here just to chat. They were here because they looked spooked. And before Dr. Allard could ask any questions about, what was going on here, one of these gravediggers began to speak. And in sort of a rapid and sort of anxious tone, he said, as we were carrying the coffin over to the gravesite, it began to shake like the person inside the coffin was alive. And then we heard all these moaning sounds coming from inside of this nailed shut coffin. And we all got so panicked that we just dropped the coffin and we ran here to tell you. Now, Dr. Allard was pretty surprised by what he was hearing, but he's also thinking that, when he hired these 4 gravediggers, they were at a local pub and they were drinking. And so he's thinking to himself, maybe something strange happened, with this coffin, or much more likely, these 4 guys are drunk. And that what they've sort of said here is just some figment of their imagination, that they're not professional, they're just drunk guys who are coming here screwing up my day. And so sort of annoyed, Dr. Allard's like, hey, I'm telling you, that guy is dead, okay? This isn't a ghost scenario, but if you're so worried about it, why don't you go get a police officer, have them come over and inspect the coffin, make sure the person is really dead in there, and then once they confirm that, please do your job and bury this guy. And so the gravediggers, they kind of, look down sort of awkwardly and they're like, okay, we'll go do that. And they turned and they left. And then Dr. Allard got back to work. And then a few hours later, Dr. Allard heard another knock on his door. And this time when the door opened, it was a police officer. And it was actually the officer that the 4 gravediggers had gone and found at Dr. Allard's suggestion. And he had gone over, checked the coffin, and the coffin wasn't moving, it wasn't making any weird sounds, it was sealed shut, there was nothing going on. And so the officer eventually instructed the gravediggers, to go ahead and bury it, there's nothing going on here. And so the gravediggers had, at that point, buried the coffin, and that had been that. And so the officer was here just to tell Dr. Allard that, hey, it's all good, he's buried, we can move on. About a week later, Dr. Allard had basically forgotten about this whole snafu around the coffin and whatever was going on with it. He was sort of on to the next thing, and he was out like he normally was at night to go for a walk. And the area that he liked to walk in the most was actually the cemetery. Not because he had some sort of morbid obsession, but because, it was often, vacant. There was nobody there. And so it was a peaceful place to go walking. And so, he's strolling through the cemetery like usual, and he's not seeing anybody like usual. But as it began to get dark, he was walking down this one row of headstones, and he looked up ahead, and he could have sworn he saw somebody standing behind a tree with their body sort of half out of the tree, half behind the tree, sort of half obscured. And he stopped and he's looking, and the whole thing just sort of felt off. Like, what is this person doing? Is that a person? Like, what's going on here? And so he's staring, and as he's looking, sure enough, this dark silhouette steps out from behind this tree. And the way they stepped out, it was like they stepped out, turned, and faced Dr. Allard, and just stood there, clearly looking right at Dr. Allard. But they're pretty far away from Dr. Allard, like there's a good distance between them. But immediately, Dr. Allard felt threatened by this person, or whatever it was. He didn't even know if it was a person. He couldn't tell if it was his mind playing tricks on him or not. He's just staring at this thing that looked like it was looking at him. And so Dr. Allard instinctively, who's now feeling a little bit frightened, turned and just started walking away, like he was done walking in the cemetery for the night. And so he turns and he starts walking, but then it's like the hairs in the back of his neck stood up. He just felt like this person, whoever it is, they're still watching me. And so he stopped after just a couple of steps and he turned back around. And now this figure is clearly marching directly towards Dr. Allard. They're almost running. They're walking real fast right towards Dr. Allard. And so now Dr. Allard's terrified. He knows there's something happening here. Why would this person be doing this? Like, is it a person? Like, what's happening here? And so Dr. Allard, he turns and starts to run. And as he's running, he hears this horrible high-pitched scream echo across the entire cemetery. And then he looks back one last time and he sees the face of this figure, this person charging towards him. And it's the same guy who died a week ago, the same sailor that he buried, the one who presumably was moving around in the coffin the gravediggers were so scared of. It was him, and he jumped on Dr. Allard and began throttling him, and Dr. Allard's on the ground staring at this ghastly face. This scream is coming out of him. He had no idea what was going on, and then Dr. Allard just blacked out. A few minutes later, Dr. Allard came to, and he sat up suddenly, and he's looking around, and there's nobody there. It's just a dark, vacant cemetery. No sign of the dead sailor's ghost or whatever, or whoever it was. They're gone. And Dr. Allard's just sitting there, his heart's racing still, and he's telling himself, like, did that even just happen? Like, it felt so real. His neck was sore from, what he felt was this guy, this thing attacking him. But at the same time, he was so sure that the face that he had seen on this person was the dead sailor's face. But how could that be? He's dead. He's buried. How could that be? And so ultimately, Dr. Allard, he got up and he hustled back to his house. But over the coming weeks, Dr. Allard sort of spiraled into madness because it was like every day, all the time, he would see out of the corner of his eye for a second, like a glimpse of this dead sailor's ghost. And it was always that face, that ghastly face, that shrieking face looking right at him. And he'd turn and, the face would disappear. But Dr. Allard, he just felt like he was almost being haunted, that something had happened, like that attack in the cemetery. It had felt so real. He felt like now this ghost was literally haunting him, but he couldn't tell anyone. I mean, he's a doctor. What's he gonna do? Tell people that a ghost is haunting him? He didn't know what to do. And so what he ended up doing after several weeks is he just began staying home and laying in bed, basically feigning illness to avoid leaving the house. And he would just lay there with his eyes closed basically all day, because as soon as he opened his eyes, he would see this dead sailor's face. He really was losing his mind. And then eventually, when Dr. Allard knew he had to stop basically staying in bed all day and go back to the hospital and sort of function in society again, go back to work, otherwise people were gonna start asking questions here, like, what's going on with you? And he didn't have an answer, When that time came and he knew it was sort of like, okay, go back to normal or tell people about this. Well, what Dr. Allard ultimately did is he decided to walk up to the roof of his house and throw himself off. He literally couldn't live with what he believed was this ghost haunting him 24/7. When the doctor's close friends found out that the doctor had taken his own life, they immediately went to the police and said, hey, wait a minute, we think this has something to do with what he was dealing with over the past several weeks. So the doctor, despite not wanting to tell anybody about, his haunting, he did sort of begin to tell a couple of his close friends. Now, he was sort of subtle about it, but he began telling people that he's like, yeah, I just keep seeing that dead sailor's face everywhere I go. I just keep seeing him. Now, he didn't highlight the fact that he was basically losing his mind over it and thought it was literally a ghost. But a couple of his close friends were aware that it almost seemed like, Dr. Allard was effectively having a mental breakdown over this dead sailor. And they did sort of connect that Dr. Allard sort of felt haunted by this dead sailor. And so, said close friends ultimately went to the police and said, hey, I know this is a stretch, but the doctor kind of thought he was being haunted by this dead sailor before he died. We think that has to do with why he took his own life. And sort of amazingly, the police, the way they responded to this was, okay, we're gonna look into this. We're gonna investigate the haunting, so to speak. And what they did is they exhumed the coffin of that dead sailor. They didn't know what else to do. They just decided they would do that. And so they raised the coffin out of the ground and they open it up and they cannot believe what they see. So it would turn out those 4 gravediggers had been totally justified in being scared about what they thought they heard and felt in that coffin when they were going to bury it. Because the sailor was not dead. He was just so drunk that it felt like he was dead. They couldn't feel his pulse. Dr. Allard had been wrong. The sailor was not dead. He was totally alive. And so as he was being carried over to the gravesite to be buried, he really was moving around inside the coffin and moaning because he was horribly hungover, but totally alive and, grappling with the fact that he's now, confined inside of this coffin. He likely had no idea what was going on, so you can imagine the types of sounds and things he might be doing. And so the gravediggers, they were right to be scared. They did get a police officer. The police officer came over, and for whatever reason, when he inspected the coffin, he saw it was sealed. There was no movement inside the coffin. It was totally quiet. So, the sailor inside, he just wasn't moving or making any sound. And so the police officer greenlit burying him. So the living sailor inside the coffin is buried underground by these gravediggers, and they go their separate ways afterwards. But then that sailor wakes up again. He begins thrashing around after being buried in the ground, and he actually managed to break out of the coffin and climb out of the ground. He saved himself. He literally, survived being buried alive. But he was furious at the doctor, who so cavalierly just decided he was dead and now go bury him. And so he decided he would play a prank on the doctor to get back at him. So what he did is he filled his coffin up with rocks and he sealed it back up and he reburied it so nobody would know anything. And then for the next week or so, he just kind of hid out and didn't let anybody know that he was actually still alive. And then, after about a week, he knew the doctor took his walks in that cemetery, and so he hid behind a tree in the cemetery and waited for the doctor to be alone making his walk. And when he saw him, it was the sailor, fully alive in the flesh, stepping out from behind the tree, looking at the doctor. That was him. It really was the sailor. And he really did run forward, shrieking, pretending to be a ghost. And he attacked Dr. Allard, basically giving him the impression that his angry ghost was attacking him. And then after Dr. Allard passed out on the ground, the sailor ran off. But for Dr. Allard, who fully believed that sailor was dead, can you imagine what he thought when he saw, the sailor attacking him and shrieking in the middle of the cemetery? He fully believed that was the sailor's ghost, and he had this totally real experience getting attacked by the ghost. And so even though he survived the encounter, it drove him mad. He began seeing the dead sailor, the ghost, everywhere he went, and it eventually drove him to kill himself. And so when the police opened up that coffin, all they saw were all the rocks the sailor had left behind. But following the doctor's suicide, that sailor apparently skipped town and was never seen again. This is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme at 8 a.m. on June 8th, 2015, 72-year-old James Lee Rogers parked his beautiful red Corvette in the parking lot of a Waffle House in Port Arthur, Texas. And as he pulled that car into the lot, James, he just felt so proud to be driving this vehicle. This was a 2007 C6 Chevy Corvette, pristine condition, and it was exactly the car that James had been dreaming about like his whole life. It drove amazing, it looked incredible, and more than that, it had all these modern elements to it. It didn't even have regular door handles. Everything was like push buttons and electric. To him, owning this car was like owning a really flashy sports car, and he thought that, anybody who saw him driving it, they knew this guy had made it. And on top of having this really cool car, James also had a pretty awesome life here in Port Arthur. He had lots of family in the area. He had grown up here. He loved living here. But he also really loved this particular Waffle House. It was where he went basically every morning in his flashy car to get his coffee. But, it wasn't just their coffee that he was drawn to. It was the wait staff. It was the regulars who went to this Waffle House. This had become like a sort of second home for him, and he really looked forward to coming here basically every day. And so he parks his Corvette, he gets out, and before he walks into the restaurant, he has to tell his dog, he brought his dog along, Leia, this cute little dog, to stay in the car because the dog was not allowed in the Waffle House. This was something he knew, but it was going to be quick. So he told Leia, to be a good girl and stay in the car, don't rip it up, this is his dream car. She was a very good dog. And so she sat down, he shut the doors, used the electric push buttons to do it. And then once he knew his dog was secure, into the restaurant he went. Once he got inside, James took his usual seat at the counter where his friend MJ was already sitting. MJ was in his 60s, and like James, he was also a fixture at this Waffle House. And so the two immediately began chit-chatting about the weather and their kids. And then at some point, James ordered his coffee and used that as a chance to catch up with some of the wait staff that he spoke to every morning. And then eventually more regulars began filtering in and out, and James made a point to chat with them and laugh with them as well. Again, this was like his second home. And in fact, on this particular day, there were so many people that he wanted to talk to coming in and out of the restaurant that he decided, my dog's fine out there. I've only been in here for a few minutes. I'm going to order some food as well. However, right after James ordered his food, he turned and he looked out the window into the parking lot. And even though he couldn't actually see his Corvette, he could see that it was extremely sunny and very hot outside. He knew that when he showed up, but he's looking out there and it just looks like a a desert out there. It's so hot and like there's nobody out there. It's just cars getting blasted by the sun. And he's thinking like Leia's out there. And even though he had the AC on when he pulled up, and so, likely his Corvette was still a little bit cool, there was no way that it was particularly comfortable in his car right now. And so before his food showed up, James turned to MJ and just said, "Hey, I'm going to be right back. You want to just like hold my seat? I'm going to go out and check on something." And MJ, who was kind of busy talking to other people, he's like, "Yeah, go ahead. I'll save your seat." And then James left the restaurant to go check on Leia. And so James, after leaving the Waffle House, he sort of ran around the corner out of view of where he had been sitting, and he went over to his beautiful dream car. And as soon as he walked up to the window, he could see that Leia was, very excited inside, happy to see James again. And, just for good measure, even though he now knew his dog's okay, he climbed inside the driver's seat and shut the door, and he turned around and he pet his dog, and he could tell the temperature inside the car was not that bad. And so he was only going to be in the restaurant for another 15, 20 minutes tops. She'd be okay. However, after only having sat inside his car for a matter of maybe like 30 or 60 seconds, he felt himself getting really hot. I mean, it was definitely not cool inside the car, and the sun's burning through the windows, and he just was like, "You know what? This is not responsible to leave my dog in here. I can't do this." And so even though he had placed his order for food, he figured he could go in there, cancel the order. He was a regular. They'd understand. He could have one more sip of coffee, but that was it. He needed to get back out here and basically put the AC back on and get him and his dog back into the comforts of their own home. But when James pushed that super fancy button on his car door that he was sort of so proud of how modern his vehicle was, when he pushed it to open his door, nothing happened. And so James, he's just staring at the door in confusion because this has never happened before. And so he starts pushing it a few more times, but again, nothing happened. And then after a few moments, when this car door was not budging, James reached across and started pushing the button on the passenger side door to see if maybe it was just an issue with, his door. But no, that door wouldn't open either. And so finally, he decided he would just try to turn the car on to see if maybe that would help. But he couldn't get his car to turn on. The Corvette was completely dead, and James had no idea why. But he knew this was not good because, this car, because it's so modern, didn't have normal handles. They really were all electric, all buttons. And so if these buttons aren't working and all the windows are up, what do you do? How do you get out? And so James, he's starting to stress out about what's going to happen here? Is he going to have to break a window of his beloved vehicle here? Is that what he's going to have to do? And also, how crazy is that? How could he have wound up in this position? But also, the sun is just burning through the glass, and he's suddenly becoming really aware of just how hot it was getting inside of his car. This is sort of becoming an emergency really quickly. I mean, because again, he can't even turn on the car, so he can't turn on the AC. He's inside of an oven at this point. And so James instinctively reached for where his phone would normally be, but it wasn't there. And that's when he remembered he had left his phone inside the Waffle House. When he had gone in earlier, it was low on charge, and he had handed it off to one of the waitstaff to go plug in somewhere. And so his phone's inside. He has no way to contact anyone. But luckily, right at that point, James looked out the corner of his eye and he saw a couple walking out of the Waffle House. And he's like, "Oh, thank goodness. Someone's coming out. I can get their attention. They can come over here and get me out of here. Or at least, call someone who can." And so he starts waving, through the front windshield at this couple as they're sort of walking generally in his direction, but they clearly didn't see him. The sun is glaring off the glass, kind of making it hard to see inside. And so James is sort of realizing this, and he's becoming more and more desperate as he and his dog are getting more and more overheated. And so he began leaning on the horn to get their attention that way, but no sound came out of his Corvette because the horn was powered by electricity, and again, the car is dead. And so James now is getting frantic. He's banging on the windows, he's screaming to them. But this is a nice car. It's totally soundproof inside. Again, there's the glare from the sun on the glass. The windows are partially tinted. They can't see or hear him. And so this couple eventually comes right near his vehicle. They climb in their car and they drive away without ever noticing him. Once they were gone, James told himself that, you know what, this is a busy area. Lots of people come in and out of this Waffle House. Someone's going to see us. Someone's going to get us out of this car. And so for the next several minutes, James looked all around him, looking for anybody walking through this parking lot, looking for people coming out of the Waffle House, and anybody who came even close to his vehicle, he would scream and yell and bang and do anything he could to get their attention. But nobody noticed him. Like no one could see or hear him. And now James and his dog were really starting to struggle with the heat inside of this vehicle. It really was like they were trapped inside of an oven. And so eventually, when it seemed like no one was going to notice them, James just began frantically looking around the interior of his car for a toolkit. He thought he had left a toolkit in here somewhere, in case of emergencies. And he's thinking, maybe there was a tool in there he could use to maybe jimmy open one of the doors, or if he had to, he could maybe use something heavy in the toolkit to break a window, just to get out that way. And so eventually, in the back seat near Leia, he found this toolkit, but when he cracked it open, he was disappointed because it really didn't have anything that useful. There were some pliers, there were some jumper cables, and a flashlight. But, James, he still took the pliers and he jammed the head of the pliers into the crack of the driver's side door to attempt to basically wrench open the door. But the pliers were very thin, and so he didn't budge the door at all. And he used a lot of energy trying to, force the door open. And remember, it's like blisteringly hot inside of the vehicle at this point, and it's getting harder and harder to breathe. Like Leah's struggling to breathe. James is, drenched in sweat, and so he drops the pliers, and he just has this huge wave of anxiety come over him that like, oh my goodness, like, is this it? Are we going to die in here? And so as like this crushing reality is coming down on him, James has this adrenaline surge, and he leans back in his seat and he starts kicking as hard as he can against the glass with his feet to try to break open the windshield or kick open the driver's side window. But amazingly, despite all of his energy going into this, he didn't crack the window at all. Like it felt like he was kicking a concrete wall. There was no budge, nothing. And so again, after exerting even more energy and now sweating even more, and it's getting harder and harder to breathe, James took those pliers and he's really gassed, he can barely breathe, and he starts smashing the head of the pliers into the window. That didn't do anything. So it's like, I can't do anything to get out of this vehicle. And so James, he sort of just like lays back in the driver's seat, which he had reclined at this point, and he's panting, he can barely breathe, he's opened up his shirt a little bit, and he's looking back at his dog, and she's really struggling, and he's just like, I can't believe this is happening. And as he's laying there, he sort of looks towards the front of the car, and his eyes land on the glove box in front of the passenger seat. And it was like, oh my goodness, how could I forget? There's a manual inside of there. There has got to be instructions for what to do if your car dies. There's got to be a way to get out. Like, it's got to be in that manual. And so suddenly, having all this energy, James sat up, he opened up the glove box, and he pulled out this manual that he had never read before. I mean, he had no reason to, but he opened it up and he began looking through it, looking for, the section that would explain what to do in case of, total power outage and you're stuck inside the vehicle. But like as he's looking at the pages, like his vision's swimming, it's so hot, he's so tired, and it's all this little text, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages, and like nothing explained the situation. It was like so not user-friendly. And so James, he's flipping through all these pages, and even just the act of turning the page was becoming so laborious, like he is just beginning to shut down. I mean, he's basically dying inside of an oven, and he can barely turn the page, and then before long, after about a quarter of the way through, it's like he couldn't see anymore, and he literally just like he couldn't turn the page anymore. He had no strength left. MJ, so James's buddy, the guy in his 60s who was also a regular at the Waffle House, he's inside the Waffle House, he's having his breakfast and his coffee. He knew James had stepped out, he was going to be right back, and he did not come right back, but he figured no big deal, like, he probably got caught up with something. Maybe he forgot that he had ordered food. But, MJ, he's got all these reasons for why James has not come back to the restaurant. And also, MJ, being a regular, he's chatting it up with other people. He's not really even aware of the fact that James has not come back inside the Waffle House. And eventually, after MJ had had his coffee and his food, he's getting ready to maybe make an exit himself, when two employees come running in the front door of the Waffle House. And so everybody turns to these employees who clearly are sort of making a scene here, And they're like, what's going on? And the employees, they're like, we just saw James. He's asleep in his car and we can't open the doors. We slammed on the windows, but he's not reacting. At this point, MJ felt sick to his stomach because he suddenly realized when he looked at his watch, it had been 4 hours since James had gone outside saying he'd be right back. Now, MJ, he got caught up doing other things and he was in here all the time. He loved being here. Time flew when he was in here, but even he didn't understand how much time had passed. And he's thinking oh my gosh, what's happened to James? And so MJ jumps out of his seat and he runs outside into the blistering heat. He goes around the corner to the red Corvette. He sees, through the tinted glass, there's James inside of the vehicle. He starts hitting on the window, but there's no answer. James isn't moving. And so MJ calls 911. It would turn out when James bought the red Corvette, it really was like his dream car. He fell in love with it. It was beautiful. It was flashy. It oozed status. It had all this new tech. It looked so expensive. It was perfect. And James, he didn't just, buy this car and that was it. After he had it, he obsessed over it. He learned every little detail about it. He took great care of it. He drove it everywhere. This was like his child. But despite, really obsessing over the car, he never learned one really important thing about this car, which is what do you do if you happen to be inside of the vehicle with the windows rolled up and your power goes out? Because the doors are not regular doors. They're powered by buttons. They're electrical. And if you have no power, you can't open them, as he found. Well, it turns out there's actually a lever under the driver's seat that once you pull it up, it pops open the driver's side door and you can get out, no matter if there's electricity or not. But that information was buried on page 80 of that owner's manual that he had pulled out and begun flipping through, but he was so delirious from heat exhaustion, he couldn't get that far into the manual. He's combing through all this really dense text. He made it about a quarter of the way through when unfortunately he and his dog Leia died from heat exhaustion. James's family filed a wrongful death case with Chevrolet, the maker of the Corvette, in 2018, but the case was dismissed. Chevrolet still makes Corvettes with these special electric doors, and there have been numerous additional incidents of people getting locked in and trapped. But in more recent Corvette models, the manuals have the information about the door's release lever much closer to the front of the manual. Our second and final story today is called A Call to Arms. On the morning of August 20th, 1862, a 17-year-old farmhand named Jean Leroux carried his axe over to a stack of logs by a barn on a farm in Ottawa Township, Minnesota. As a farmhand, Jean was responsible for lots of different odd jobs, like splitting the firewood and feeding the animals and helping with the crops. Basically, Jean had to know every single inch of the farm and the woods that surrounded it, and how to take care of it all. But even though he was basically constantly busy, Jean still found his mind wandering to a place that was sort of difficult, which was he felt a lot of times pretty homesick. So Jean was actually from France, and he had left behind his whole family and his, previous life to come here to America, where there was supposed to be more opportunity. However, America was turning out to be a pretty violent place. The country was currently fighting the Civil War. And on top of that, the area specifically where Jean lived was pretty much like the frontier. And so there were these constant territorial disputes and virtually no law enforcement. So just a really dangerous place. But more than any dangers he faced, Jean just really missed his family, especially his mom. So he spent basically every spare minute he had, which was, few and far between, sitting out in the woods by this one particular just huge, beautiful oak tree. And he would sit at the base of it and he would make journal entries about basically everything he was doing so he could track it all and know what to tell his mom when he finally got to see her again. He just wanted to tell her all about his experience. Also, just for context, Jean had saved virtually all the money he had worked so hard to acquire, and his whole plan was to eventually send that money to his mother, who he loved so very much and missed so much. But more and more, like the more homesick he became, the more he wished he could actually just go back to France and get out of America and literally hand the money to his mom and just see her again and be done with this whole America experiment. But for now, Jean raised his axe over his head and he brought it down on the log that he was going to split. And it did, it split open, and he raised the axe again to chop another log, but as he did, he froze, because off in the distance, he could hear a series of repetitive booming noises, like really loud. And for Jean, immediately his heart started to race and he was so scared because he knew what those were. Those were gunshots. And he was terrified that the thing that he, and really everybody else in his town, had been scared of for days was now finally happening. So right on the other side of the woods that surrounded the farm was the Minnesota River. And over the last decade, lots of people had settled along this river. And there'd been a town established right nearby, and new homes were being built constantly. However, all the expansion had literally forced out the indigenous tribe who had previously lived in the area, the Sioux. And after being displaced, these Sioux had struggled to find food and a place to live, while the settlers just continued to expand and take more of their land. So finally, just 2 days earlier, the Sioux had had enough, and they finally retaliated, attacking settlements along that river. It was being called the Sioux Uprising, and the attacks so far had been horrific. A lot of farms along that river had been burned to the ground, and their occupants had been killed right alongside it. And then just yesterday, the Sioux had attacked a city that was just 50 miles down the river from where Jean was right now. And so Jean and everybody else in this particular area had really been terrified the last 24 hours that the violence was moving in their direction towards Ottawa Township. And so now Jean, he had put his axe down and he just stood there, trembling as the sound of gunshots continued. This was not just a few stray bullets. This was a barrage of gunfire. And so this could only mean one thing. The Sioux were here. Now, Jean couldn't tell exactly where the shooting was coming from, but he could tell it was pretty close. And so Jean knew that he likely only had maybe several minutes to gather up whatever he could of his possessions and get to safety before the Sioux arrived. So Jean, he bolts over to the farmhouse, goes inside, and he goes to the area inside where he slept, and he grabbed his rifle, and he also grabbed his notebook and all that cash he'd been saving for his mom. And he jammed the notebook and the cash into a satchel, and with his rifle over his shoulder, he ran back outside. And then once he was outside, he sprinted right towards the tree line at the edge of the property. And after running for a little while, Jean finally stopped to catch his breath and to listen to see if there was more gunfire. And as he sat there listening, he couldn't hear anything. But that's when he realized, he's all alone out here. If the Sioux came charging through the trees right now, he wouldn't stand a chance, even with his rifle. But Jean had an advantage. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. He was in here all the time. And because of that, he knew exactly where to go to find safety. About an hour later, Jean's boss and the owner of the farm, Edward Gleek, hustled from his farmhouse towards town. Mr. Gleek had also heard the gunshots. Basically everybody in town had. And he had come running out of the barn just in time to see his farmhand, Jean Leroux, bolting off into the woods. And, Mr. Gleek, he didn't blame the kid. He was also horrified by the recent attacks and was also very worried that those shots they were hearing were a sign that trouble had finally arrived in their town. But after all these gunshots, no Sioux warriors showed up in town. And so now Mr. Gleek was heading to the town center to see what had actually happened. What were those gunshots? Now, Mr. Gleek had sort of accepted that this could have been something totally benign, or it could have been the Sioux. He didn't know. But he was just going to find out. He was rational. He was calm, despite, the risks here. But when he got into the town center, all he could see was just chaos. Many of the area's residents were out running around, carrying trunks and bags and all their belongings like they were fleeing the area, much like Mr. Gleek's farmhand, Jean Leroux, had looked like he was doing. However, it didn't take long for Mr. Gleek to hear what had happened, and it was not an attack by the Sioux. Those people running around like maniacs, fleeing the area, they just hadn't heard the real story yet. They were sort of operating like there was an attack coming. So apparently, a group of American soldiers had been riding on a boat up the Minnesota River, and for some reason, they just gotten overly excited and began firing their guns repeatedly. So those were gunshots. And unfortunately, because they were gunshots, they completely freaked out all the residents around the river because of this growing threat of the Sioux attacking. But fortunately, at least in this case, there were no attacks. This was just, an unfortunate event. And so after hearing this, Mr. Gleek went back to his farm to find Jean and tell him that, everything was actually just fine. But when he got there, Jean still had not come back yet. And when Mr. Gleek went into the woods to go look around for him, he couldn't find him. Now, Mr. Gleek figured that Jean would eventually find out what happened, much like everybody else in town. I mean, not everyone had the news yet, and so at some point that day, he was bound to return. But by the time night fell, Jean still had not come back. And then the next day, Jean didn't come back. And the next day, and the next day, he just didn't come back. And so finally, after repeatedly searching his property and asking all over town if anybody had seen Jean, Mr. Gleek finally came to the conclusion that Jean must have fled because of this Sioux attack, and then likely gone back to France to be with his mother, something he knew he wanted to do anyways. Maybe this was his excuse. 57 years later, on a morning in July of 1919, Mr. Gleek sat on his porch looking out over his farm, the same farm that Jean had been a farmhand for 57 years earlier. Mr. Gleek was old now, and so he could no longer actually physically work on the farm himself. So instead, he had to hire entire crews to do various jobs. And in fact, right now, he had a whole bunch of workers out in the woods clearing away some dead brush for him. And so as Mr. Gleek is just kind of surveying his property, he notices a worker come running out of the tree line and starts waving at Mr. Gleek really frantically, like he had something really important to say. And then as the man got closer, Mr. Gleek could see that this worker looked terrified. And before Mr. Gleek could ask what had happened, the worker, whose face was, white as a ghost, said Mr. Gleek needed to come and see something. And so Mr. Gleek, who was, very intrigued at this point, managed to haul himself up and he slowly hobbled off into the woods with this worker. And as he got to where the rest of the crew was, inside the forest, he saw that they were all mostly gathered around this very large, recently downed oak tree. And the whole group was very quiet and tense, and they were all just staring at a section of this tree that had split open. When Mr. Gleek joined the group and looked at this particular section of the trunk of this tree, this hollow part, at first he didn't even know what he was staring at. It was just this hollowed out sort of split section of the tree, and there was a few items that didn't belong there that were inside of it, like a cache of sorts. But then he sort of fixated on one particular item, and that's when he understood why the group was just so stunned. And as he stared and sort of took in what he was seeing, he suddenly became utterly horrified. It would turn out, when Jean ran off into the woods 57 years earlier, he used his intimate knowledge of the farmland and the surrounding woods to escape what he thought was a very dangerous situation. And he did that by hiding. Jean knew that oak tree where he would always go when he would write in his notebook happened to have a hollow trunk. And he figured he'd be just the right size to crawl inside of there and stay in there hidden until the Sioux were gone. And so Jean had made it to the tree, and he had wedged himself inside of there, totally out of view. And then unfortunately, he got stuck. From inside the trunk of the tree, Jean had managed to write one last letter to Mr. Gleek, saying that he couldn't get out, he was stuck. And if he did die here, to please give all his money to his mother in France. And so decades later, when Mr. Gleek's workers cut that big oak tree down, what they found inside of the hollow trunk was Jean's gun, his money, his notebook, and his mummified body. This is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Locasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Locasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Today's stories are about real people who try to control fate, and what they end up doing is just causing historic levels of destruction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to rearrange the Follow Buttons pantry. But instead of actually doing that, just remove all the labels from their canned goods. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called The Inn. On the morning of June 26, 1826, 38-year-old Samuel Willie Jr. stepped out of his house in a remote area of New Hampshire's White Mountain Range called the Notch. His wife, Polly, was at his side, and together they looked around in shock because the land surrounding their home was almost completely destroyed. There had been a huge storm the previous night, and so Sam and Polly had been expecting some damage. But what they were seeing now was far worse than they had imagined. The heavy rain had caused the river in front of their home to completely overflow, so half of their property was now completely submerged in water. The deluge had also triggered a rock slide from one side of the mountain slopes behind them, so there were also rocks and mud and entire trees that were now kind of littering their yard and adjacent fields. Sam saw, luckily, the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock, but only barely, and there was damage to those structures from the storm itself that he would have to repair. So Sam began calculating how much time and money it was going to take to clean all this up. And next to him, he heard Polly kind of mumble to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam sighed because he knew that Polly was referring to their decision to move to the Notch in the first place. And right now, staring at all this awful destruction right in front of him, he had to agree with her. This might have been a terrible idea. So up until about a year ago, Sam and Polly and their 5 kids had lived on a farm about 20 miles away from where they were right now, and it had been a very quiet, cozy life. But Sam had always had this feeling that he wanted to do something more exciting than just be a regular old farmer. And with this house in the Notch, he'd seen an opportunity for adventure, and also an opportunity to make some money. So in this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a 12-mile-long road that cut through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house was right in the middle of that road. But since this was the year 1826, this road was more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous and rocky, and neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through. So as a result, travelers were typically on foot. And there was literally nowhere to stop on this whole 12-mile road except for the Willie's Notch house. So Sam had realized how valuable this Notch house could be if he converted it into an inn. But he also had bigger aspirations for the place, like beyond it just being a pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a destination. After all, the White Mountains were incredibly beautiful, and where the Willies lived in the Notch was no exception. Their house was right on a riverbank in a mountain valley, surrounded on all sides by the woods and towering mist-covered peaks. It was all honestly breathtaking. And as soon as Sam had seen it, he knew that it could be a famous destination for poets and authors and artists because it was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. I mean, it was perfect. But so far, his dream, of coming out here to the Notch house had been a lot of work. The house was large, but really old, and it had been abandoned for a while before he and his family got there, so it was in really bad shape and quite dilapidated. Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up, and they'd already done some work to expand the house and the barn to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a lot to do before the Notch house became some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to fix, which he also had to admit was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly looked around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew, really, he was lucky that their house was even still standing, and that he and his family were even still alive. I mean, that storm was catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they'd come to death, his heart began to race. I mean, he wondered if if Polly was right, and they should really at this point just pack the family up and go back to simple farming because it was safer. But leaving meant sort of admitting failure. His big dream would be over. There would be no artist's retreat, no tourist mecca. He would not be some creative benefactor. He'd just be a farmer. So he took a deep breath, and then he asked his wife to please give this place one more chance. He promised he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but also make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain threw at them. And Polly hesitated, but ultimately she believed in her husband, and she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers worked practically around the clock repairing the damage from the storm. They fixed up windows and shingles and cleared away all the debris, which took forever. And then once all the repairs were done, Sam continued working, but now he focused on improving the property. As the weeks passed by, he worked very hard to build his family a very secure home so they'd be much safer against future storms. He reinforced walls and built a whole new roof and mapped out disaster scenarios so that he and his family would always be prepared. One disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was right behind their house. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just topple onto them and crush them. And he and his workers soon realized that they couldn't actually move the boulder. It was just way too big. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be dangerous. And while Sam did all this work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place was proof that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Sam Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain pummeled the glass, and Sam could hear powerful wind battering the sides of the house. It was pitch black out, but every now and then there was a burst of lightning that would light the whole valley up for a few seconds before it went dark again. Each time this happened, a crash of thunder would follow that was so loud it shook the house down to its foundation. Behind Sam, Polly, along with their 5 kids and the 2 men that were working on the property, were all sitting at the kitchen table. And Polly and the kids in particular were very scared, and the whole group were reading Bible verses, in these kind of frantic hushed tones, like they were trying to, will the storm to be over and to cling on to their faith, to pray that they'd be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her, because this was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger than that one that completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed. And each time there was a burst of lightning, Sam could see the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam was admittedly quite scared himself. He tried to keep that in, but his heart was racing and he was really anxious. But he told himself that this was the moment he'd prepared for all summer long. I mean, this was it. He had done so much work to make sure this was a safe place during storms. And he felt like they'd be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his kids were making it really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really okay here. So for a little while, Sam just kept looking out the window, listening to his family behind him. But then eventually he turned around, and as calm as he could, he told them all to go to bed. It was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, nodded and got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was very loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. I mean, there was going to be damage tomorrow, but Sam was thinking that, maybe we're going to get through this thing. But a little after midnight, Sam heard this sudden, extremely loud banging sound outside, and he froze because he knew it was not thunder. It sounded more like an explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn must have collapsed. And thinking that this storm had just taken out an entire building that he had reinforced for a storm, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screams for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up, that it's not safe, get away from the windows, we have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, everyone's frantically scrambling around, trying to find a safe spot, but they don't know where it is. But as they're sort of navigating, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang, and then there were screams all around him, and then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that road in the direction of the Notch House where the Willies lived. So John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a business trip. And he had made this trip many times before. He knew the road, but the road currently was flooded and there was rock slides and damage everywhere, so it was quite slow going and pretty miserable. But he knew at the halfway point was this house, the Notch House, where Sam Willie and his family lived, and they were looking to convert their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John knew he could very likely get into that house, have a hot meal, rest a little bit before he made the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze because the area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also been clearly a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, and the field in front of the Willies was completely buried in rocks and mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place, not even a window. Relieved and a little amazed, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked. But no one answered. So eventually he just opened the door and poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply and nobody moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor and beds, and sheets had been yanked around and were messy, and the Bible was wide open on the kitchen table. John stood in the middle of the home trying to work out what could have happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but had left in a hurry. So John guessed they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, either at a neighbor's or the tavern, miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to allow him to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of still sleeping in the home without them here. But he really had nowhere else to go. And it was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone during the dark. So even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately woke up and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was almost completely dark outside. He waited to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound and turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe the sound was one of the Willies and that they hadn't actually left the property, but were maybe outside, injured or in trouble because of this storm. So John sprinted outside, but again, it was pitch black outside and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting out, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning answered him. But the moaning kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from, other than it clearly being outside somewhere. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house, and for hours he just sat in bed and listened to the moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right outside to look around, and this time he quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willies' oxen, moaning in pain from being trapped under some debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the wooden planks and rocks off the ox, And after he had freed the animal, it amazingly staggered to its feet and hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness, even though the sound had been from an ox and he had saved it. He just felt like there was something wrong here, and so he decided that he had to go and see the willies with his own eyes, just to make sure they really were okay. So even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was exhausted, he was drenched, from this awful journey he had just taken again on this road. But more than that, he was really worried about the willies, because as he made that trip down the road, he saw neighbors' homes along the way and kind of expected to see the willies in one of them. But no, the willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes, and in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all basically in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern because of the storm. But when John looked around the tavern, he could tell the willies were not in there either, and this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had, but eventually everyone just shook their head and said, "No, we don't know where they are." And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property, and so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this part of the world. And there were not a lot of people doing that. I mean, this was a very small community, and so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the willies' property and find these people, it took so long to navigate the road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see, the home really was just as John described. It was sort of a mess, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer, and because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next storm. And it seemed like all his preparations and reinforcements on his land had paid off, because here his house was standing tall. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why did the willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the house, he saw that the willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table wide open, and when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but, kind of shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the property for signs of the willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside to find the willies, or at least to find a clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still there had been nothing found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point, the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange buzzing sound, and so he followed it, and eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. So the thing that Sam Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move said boulder, or otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second shelter that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willys' disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam's screaming for his family to, take cover, get away from the windows. He's heard this crashing sound outside that he is convinced is the sound of his barn collapsing, and, his house is next. He's yelling for them to take cover. Well, the family listened to him, and together they did seek cover. They left the main house and went into that second shelter that they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic mistake, because that humongous boulder right behind the house was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was like a protective barrier. When there was an actual rock slide during this horrible storm, well, the rubble actually piled up on the backside of that boulder and did not strike the house at all. And so in essence, this boulder basically made the Willys' original home the single safest place to be on the whole property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they were overtaken by the rock slide and killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand reached out from underneath the rubble. Ultimately, because of this tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willys had hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what happened, and before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy, and some even wrote books about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he hoped. Our next story is called The Burning Room. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. So Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by reading their palms or using crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she typically was right, which was why, out of the 400-something fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like royalty and wives of very high-up government members and other very wealthy people of high society. And it was a big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people, because she did not come from money. Actually, there was a time where she almost had to live out on the streets, because years ago, when her husband died, she was left alone with her 3 kids and really no way to provide for them. But she'd worked very hard and actually ended up thriving. Her kids had grown up, and she turned her fortune-telling talents into a real business. She'd been so successful that she really was maybe about 3 clients away from being able to retire. And Marie was not one to just sit back and let those clients magically find her. She was a self-made woman and knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so that's why she was at this party now. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene, and so many of the guests at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to try to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to the audience was that Marie was very drunk. So Marie was loud and talkative in general, and that extroverted attitude really helped her get clients typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll, because her stories were drawing gasps and laughs, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed bothered by what Marie was saying, the hostess of the party, The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was silently trying to tell her to shut up. But Marie figured she knew why she was acting that way. I mean, the hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie's getting all this attention and potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. Like, she just got to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding and her stomach was in knots. I mean, she was severely hungover from drinking the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened the night before, but she did remember telling a lot of stories. And she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the whole time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if she'd said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if, the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that, somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, her career, from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening, until that night, when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous and kept fidgeting and smoothing her hair, and she told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party and was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension she'd been holding up over the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment, despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time. That clearly, here she is getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this woman, and maybe there were more, like it had been a success. So very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars and crystals and bottles of potions and decks of cards to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room, and once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told because she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie. She'd seen a lot of nervous, frail women like this one who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women that were in this position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really what these women were looking for was control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she grabbed this woman's hand and she turned it around and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading her palm. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely, and then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because, after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete shock. She had no idea what they were doing there, but they immediately just grabbed her and said she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and she had friends in high places like Parliament and noble circles. They could vouch for her and say that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her, and without reacting to what she was saying, they just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at this, her heart sank and she stopped struggling, because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the whole city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded high-ranking officials in parliament surrender their wives to authorities, throwing the Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing the French nobility out of their castles to go face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last, until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's favorite mistress. By the time the police finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing charges or sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country, and then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So Marie Bosse was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had poisoned someone or been poisoned by someone. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used like a solution for many kinds of problems, like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and poison them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden, because remember, they can't get divorced. So if you're stuck with somebody and you don't like them, well, just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best kept secret, until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie told stories of poisoning people, and people thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these stories. And so he wondered if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and the hostess is kind of trying to signal her to stop talking about it, but Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police, and the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, read her palm and read her future, but then also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband, poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years, and during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners to royalty. 23 of those people were banished, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Bosse. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.